Gustav Adolf Heubel, the grandson of Jan Kohl, the co-founder of Vlare & Kohl Bank, and his wife, aristocrat Cornelie van Haren Norman, were expecting the birth of their fourth child any day. Cornelie's parents instilled heavy superstitious beliefs in her since a young age, and Friday the 13th was quickly approaching. She couldn't have a baby born on such an ominous day. Friday the 13th would drag on, and despite her panic, it would pass. Florentine Sophia Heubel, nicknamed Florrie, was born the following day, Saturday, November 14th, 1914. Florentine was the youngest of her three siblings. Her oldest brother Dolph was born in 1904, her sister Annie was born in 1906, and her other brother was born on June 7th, 1910. The family would live in Amsterdam before moving to the small town of Laren in North Holland. It was the oldest town in the region. Gustav was a German citizen. In the year Florentine was born, he was drafted into the German military. This was a difficult time for the family, a time Florentine would describe as cold and lonely. Despite her father being drafted into the military and being deployed shortly after she was born, she had nothing but fond memories of her childhood, saying,
"I had a wonderful childhood. Life for me was full of sunshine."
Florentine and Wim were homeschooled, having a tutor come to their home, while Dolph and Annie would go to school. Since an early age, Florentine was one with nature. This was likely due to her having a beautiful property, with swans, chickens, and German shepherds, all of which she'd spend much of her time playing with, even getting punished for not doing her schoolwork because she was outside, or too dirty to go in. The gardener was her companion, and she would say, "All the animals and plants were our friends." Young Florentine would spend her summers outside in the pond, playing with the dogs and catching frogs.
In summer, I could often be found at our little pond, where I loved to catch small frogs. I put them into my white apron to show them to my mother. She was scared of them, and this made me scared, too. I would let go of my apron, and all the little frogs would jump into and on top of everything. Mother would get very angry at this, and the tutor would put me in the corner.
Gustav would return home shortly before the war ended, where he would take up work at Vlare & Kohl. Shortly after taking this position, they decided to buy a new home and move the family to Hilversum, a beautiful property, but Gustav believed it was too small for a family of their size, sending Florentine and Wim to their grandparents' house in Amsterdam while the house was completely remodeled.
Stijn, our grandparents' maid, never failed to impress me with her pretty lace caps, her blue and white striped blouse, and her starched, snow-white apron. She was the head of the household, and we respected her greatly. She was the one who greeted us when we arrived at our grandparents' house. She took me by the hand and led us into the living room, where our grandparents were waiting for us. Dim bowed in front of grandfather, then kissed him on his cheek. I curtsied before throwing my arms around grandmother's neck. We knew what was expected of us. Our tutor hadn't failed to give us a few extra lessons before we left home. We were glad she hadn't accompanied us on this trip.
The time Florentine and Wim spent at their grandparents', she remembered her favorite memory was a trip to the famous puppet theater in Amsterdam. But one memory, she says, casts a shadow on her entire stay with her grandparents.
Each night, Stijn would take me up to a room on the second floor, where she tucked me into a huge old bed. In this room was a sideboard with a mirror, and on top of the sideboard, my grandparents kept an old, silver clock with a pendulum. Stijn told me not to fuss or cry. Then she would turn off the lights and close the door. The clock frightened me and made me feel very lonely, way up there on the second floor. I would lay awake and listen to the chime that sounded every quarter of an hour, followed by deep, hollow strokes. I could not fall asleep, and all the beams and planks seemed to creak and crack around me. Often I was still awake to hear the clock strike midnight.
After their stay at their grandparents', Gustav would pick up Florentine and Wim where they'd excitedly travel back to Hilversum, anxious to see their newly remodeled home. She would describe it as a wonderful house, and surely one of the most beautiful houses in Hilversum. It would become known as the Sunshine House. The family was held in very high regard in the area, and they would hold many social events at their home. At one of these events, the family would meet Queen Wilhelmina. Florentine and Wim would be invited to play tennis with Princess Juliana.
She went to my mother to ask her if she would let us come to her house to play tennis with Princess Juliana, who was visiting her during vacation. My mother dressed us in our best clothes, and promptly sent us to the princess. We had to drink a cup of tea with her and Madame Guipin before we went outside. We were told to let the princess win, although we were much better players. We tried our best to lose. But Juliana was such a terrible player that we won anyway, no matter how hard we tried not to. Juliana did not mind this at all. She was a nice person, very friendly and courteous.
She would later write the happiest years of the family's life were spent at the Sunshine House. Gustav would teach the kids about nature, taking them hiking, survival, how to prepare a backpack for any situation they might find themselves in. Gustav, being a German citizen that moved to Holland, would teach the kids to love their native countries and introduce them to German literature. Cornelie taught the kids about gardening in their greenhouse, as well as art. She was a talented artist, something Florentine would also fall in love with. Florentine and Wim were both born with red hair. This is something Gustav disliked, and this had an impact on young Florentine, as she'd write about it in multiple instances. One of the times she would note that her father would always shave Wim's head.
It was so short, the top of his head looked like a stubble field. Everyone teased him so mercilessly about it.
Despite the dislike for their red hair, Gustav loved them both very much. As they got older, Gustav decided Annie and Florentine should attend the Godeline School, an all-girls secondary school, while Dolph would attend high school in Bussum and Wim in Hilversum. At the Godeline School, Florentine would befriend another girl that she described as visually the, quote, total opposite. Florentine had blue eyes and red blonde hair, and her friend had dark skin, brown hair, and brown eyes. She'd write wherever they'd go, they would receive comments saying, "Here comes light and dark."
I had a strong sense for colors, which I developed early.
Florentine held no malice for the young girl, and they became best friends. Florentine would struggle in school to keep passing grades, not because she couldn't do the work, but like her homeschooling, she'd rather be in nature and doing artwork, as well as a general disinterest in certain subjects. It was difficult for her to maintain focus. However, she did very well in classes that she had been interested in, German language classes, history, writing, and art. But her favorite subject was biology. She would credit much of her interest to her teacher, Miss Indenburg.
We had a biology teacher, Miss Eidenberg, who was very ugly but knew how to present the subject in a captivating way, for which I am still grateful to her to this day. Once a week, she would take us on a nature walk in a nearby wood, where she would point out interesting trees and plants. She would teach us how to recognize different bird calls and make our homework exciting by giving us assignments, such as drawing a special leaf or pressing some interesting plant we had found.
This love of biology would guide her life going forward. Florentine would graduate, and following the family tradition, the children would be sent to another country to learn a new language before college. Florentine would go to Switzerland before going to England, where she would become fluent in English. From there, she started college, where she would take 2 years of biology. At the end of the 2 years, she had to decide whether she wanted to further her studies in botany or zoology. She would decide to take zoology, which she had more interest in than plants. She would go on vacation before starting college again. She vacationed in Dahlem, Germany, near Berlin. While in Germany, Florentine would witness the rise of Adolf Hitler.
From close at hand, I witnessed the rise of Hitler. To live through such historic events was an experience so breathtaking that nothing will ever erase it from my mind. Thank you, Berlin, oh wonderful, beautiful city of culture.
After her stay in Germany, she would return to the Netherlands and begin college. Florentine was always studying hard. Her upbeat personality helped her mask an illness. She wouldn't tell anyone about it, But one day she was too sick to get out of bed. After a doctor's examination, she would be told that she would need surgery on her gallbladder, a surgery which her father objected to. But she had no other option. Florentine's resilience and refusal to tell anyone caused a lot of complications in what should have been a relatively routine surgery. The surgery would be extended much longer than expected, which kept her under anesthesia longer than what was deemed to be safe. Upon waking, she remained very ill for days, weeks, months, ultimately spending nearly an entire year inside the hospital. Every day the doctor did his best to cheer Florentine up, but it was a struggle which the doctor expected her to lose. He would allow Florentine to return home for Christmas, under the belief she would be better off dying in her own home, with her family during the holidays, rather than in the hospital. But Florentine wasn't one to give up without a fight. She would remain home. Despite her bad health, she would keep fighting. One day she would have an extremely high fever, which the doctor would rush to their home in Hilversum. When the doctor arrived, he would tell the family she has 2 or 3 days maximum to live. But if she got in the car and rushed to the hospital, she could get a second surgery that she had been resisting, and she would have a chance to survive. Both of her parents would object to the second surgery, seeing the first as a failure, and her father saying, quote, "Surgery doesn't work." She would get in the car on her own despite her parents' objections. She would make it to the hospital and undergo the surgery. This time it would be successful. Towards the end of February, she recovered enough, and on February 21st, 1936, she would be released from the hospital, where she would celebrate with all of her family and friends.
As a young girl, confined to the hospital, I often had to do battle with myself. I was only 22 years old, and with each day, I seemed to be getting weaker and weaker. It seemed as though I had fallen into a deep sleep, to be rudely awakened by the doctor asking me to choose between life and death. After this I felt like a child, down at the Lord's feet, saying, "Please, do with me as you like," because I already felt the light embracing me like a cosmic power, surrounding my bed, ready to take me. I can still see the bright, fatherly eyes of Dr. Brand as he told me that my parents did not want him to operate. But luckily, he did it anyway. The sun was shining for me once more. I had entered the hospital as a celebrated young girl and left it as a mature young woman.
Her parents now wanted to do anything to prevent this from happening again. They would bring Florentine to Oberschlemme, Germany, where she would be observed by the best doctors around for a month. While in Germany, this would be the first time she saw and heard Adolf Hitler speak on March 26, 1936.
Wir sind doch wieder ein so anständiges Volk geworden. Wir sind doch jetzt wieder ein so fleißiges und tatkräftiges Volk geworden. Was schaffen wir jetzt nicht wieder in Deutschland? Was haben wir nicht für Aufgaben? Man hat uns die ganzen Jahre schon eingeredet, dass der Deutsche sowieso nicht ganz gleichbürtig sei den anderen Völkern in der Welt. Was haben wir heute für Aufgaben? Was für gewaltige Werke bauen wir? Wir bauen heute die schönsten Straßen, gewaltige Anlagen, industrielle Art, neue Erfindungen haben wir gemacht, ungeheure Wohnhauskolonien, sie werden entstehen und sind bereits entstanden. Was wird nicht überall gearbeitet auf allen Gebieten? Wir haben bewiesen in diesen 3 Jahren, dass wir ein Volk sind, das bestehen kann vor den anderen. Und darum bitte ich dich nun, deutsches Volk, darüber gib nun dein Urteil ab. Der Welt unterstelle ich mich nicht, die kann mich nicht richten.
The crowd was exuberant and there was excitement, but the most important thing was that it gave everyone hope.
A few days later, Florentine would leave Germany and went to Prague for a short stay before returning to the Netherlands. While there, she'd officially decided to study zoology.
I applied to the Institute of Bird Research in Helgoland under Dr. Hackmeyer, as well as to the Institute of Marine Biology under Dr. von Buddenbrock. To my great joy, I was accepted, and in August I saw this holy land for the first time. Wonderful Helgoland, with its highland and lowland, its storms and fishermen, seemed like part of the long-lost Atlantis. What an island, what cosmic powers, this sanctuary, Helgoland. A time I will never forget. It was hard to say my farewells. Helgoland had become holy to me. It is a cosmic island, solitary amid the stormy sea, a part of the lost Atlantis. Never will I forget Helgoland. Here one gathers new strength. It stole my heart.
While at Helgoland, she would study the thousands of birds that would visit. They were tasked with rescuing any birds that were injured or caught in nets. They would bring them for examination before releasing them after necessary precautions or rehabilitation were taken. While studying, she would recognize a strong interest in the field of animal psychology, which was a brand new field at the time, pioneered by Professor Konrad Lorenz, who Florentine called her idol. She would read every book on the subject that she could get her hands on, before approaching her professor, Dr. Drost, and asking him his recommendation on pursuing this further. Dr. Drost would tell her that there was only one teacher in the Netherlands that he could think of. It was Dr. Berends de Haan, who worked at the Amsterdam Royal Zoo. This would be a slight disappointment, as she wanted to travel abroad instead of staying in the Netherlands, but she would thank Dr. Drost and return home to the Netherlands. Florentine would contact Dr. Berends de Haan and express her interest in working under him, and they would set a meeting.
I had announced my arrival, so the professor was waiting for me in his room. He sat behind his desk, with a chair close by for me to sit on. He looked at me with his big eyes, serious, but with a flicker of amusement. His hair was combed over the top of his balding head. He asked me how I thought that he could be of service. I was nervous at first, but then managed to tell him about my studies, ending by asking him if he would be willing to take me on as his assistant. I told him that I had received his address from Dr. Drost in Helgoland. I was accepted and could start the following Monday, but he expected me to be punctual and meet him for lunch at the artist restaurant every day, where he dined with the other professors, talking about work-related questions or problems. It was a great honor for me to be able to meet some of these famous researchers. Overjoyed, I drove home that night to tell my parents about this success.
Florentine would arrive on Monday at the doctor's office, where they would talk for a little while before he'd inform her that she would have an entire laboratory of her own.
He showed me his collection of books and offered to lend them to me to the extent that I had not already read them. These books were sacred to him, and he warned me not to put spots or wrinkles on the pages. I promised to take good care of them.
She would be informed of her duties, which were to monitor the eating habits and the intelligence of the zoo's monkeys. She would go to her office and begin her duties.
As soon as I was alone in my room, I looked at the monkeys, somewhat vacuously. I realized that was expected to do a good job, but as yet had no idea how to tackle the matter. I started looking at the wonderful books, and before I knew it, the bell rang and I had to go downstairs. I quickly pushed the chair under the table and made sure the desk was in order. I wanted to make a good impression, and after everything was properly organized,
She would take her lunch break with the doctor, which went over well. But when she'd returned to her office, a small mistake she made before leaving had led to a disaster. She had made sure all the chairs were pushed in and the books were set neatly on the table, but she overlooked the intelligence and the reach of the monkeys.
I opened the door to my room and my chair stood against one of the cages. The table was overturned, and all the valuable books were on the bottom of the cages. The monkeys had grabbed the books through the wire mesh and acted as though they had been reading books their entire life. Some of them were scribbling in the books with my pencils, and some were tearing one page out after the other.
The books were destroyed. The doctor would go downstairs, not saying a word to Florentine. She would stay late trying to clean up the mess before she had to go home. For the next week she'd come to work as usual, but the doctor wouldn't say a word to her, not inviting her to lunch or anything else. She would offer her apologies, but he wouldn't listen. It made the workplace tense and uncomfortable. When she'd return after the weekend, she'd be calling to the doctor's office. It was nerve-wracking. She would make eye contact with the doctor. Minutes felt like an eternity.
The professor looked at me with piercing eyes. Suddenly he started laughing. Dr. Berends de Haan, the always so serious professor, exploded with laughter. I was so surprised that I just stared at him for a minute. But then I couldn't help myself, but joined in the laughter. We both sat there for about 10 minutes, laughing so hard that the tears ran down our faces. He said, "Miss Heubel, I have never seen anything like this in my entire life. One monkey on my head, the other on my shoulder. I was sweating out of fear and was so relieved when the guard came and took charge of the situation. What do I care about the books anymore? This was a performance I shall never forget as long as I live. And I'm telling you, I will cherish this wonderful act forever. How excellent, what a comical farce.
While Florentine mindlessly stared at the monkeys on her first day, focused on the books instead of observing their intelligence, they would forcefully prove their intelligence to her. Fortunately for Florentine, the doctor was able to make light of this misfortune. While Florentine was working at the zoo, her brother Dolf was working as an engineer in the Dutch Indies, and her mother wanted to go visit him, his wife, and his kids. Her mother planned the trip before even telling her, but she was excited when she was told about it. They would board their ship on October 21st, 1938. They would have a layover in Genoa, Italy. Women Florentine would meet with the fascist youth organization Balia. With the Balia, they would go see Mussolini's speech at Palazzo Verde in Rome.
Camicie nere di Verona, questa mia un poco molto Verona, questa Verona romana, bersaglieresca, fascista nell'anima fino dalla vigilia. Con questa maestosa adunata di popolo, accompagnata da uno schieramento superbo di forze, si chiude il mio viaggio tra le genti del Veneto e il mio pellegrinaggio sui campi sacri delle nostre gloriose battaglie. Camerati, è inutile che i diplomatici si affatichino ancora per salvare Versaglia. L'Europa che fu costruita a Versaglia spesso con una piramidale ignoranza della geografia e della storia, questa Versaglia agonizza. La sua sorte si decide in questa settimana. È in questa settimana che può sorgere la nuova Europa. L'Europa della giustizia per tutti e della riconciliazione fra i popoli. Camicie nere, noi del Littorio siamo per questa nuova Europa.
After this, they would continue their trip. On November 14th, they would reach their destination in Batavia. They were excitedly welcomed by their family, and they would go tour the town before making their way to the Hotel des Indes, where they would stay the night. The next day they would travel to southern Sumatra, where Dolf lived.
The road to Tanjung Karang had the most beautiful palm trees and little creeks, along with the loveliest little houses. My brother had put up a flag for us. What a welcome. All the families of Tanjung Karang came over that night, and we drank and celebrated. Dolf showed us the different plantations, and we were taken on an excursion to a rubber factory. There were many other crops, such as rice, peppers, and bananas. I had a chance to catch a small tiger cub at the plantation, my first present for artists. Everywhere we could hear gibbon monkeys in the trees, and the forest was further inhabited by lizards, snakes, and beautiful butterflies. Another plantation had mostly coffee plants.
After this, Florentine would meet with the director of the zoo before continuing the trip.
Our trip now led us through large rice plantations. In the distance, the mountains were surrounded by fog in the early morning light. There were water buffalo walking about, and swarms of birds could be seen over the plantations. Next we visited the world-famous Borobudur, the largest and most beautiful Hindu construction of Java. The following days, we visited many Hindu and Brahmin temples. We came past the old palaces of the Sultan of Jogja. Then we took a boat to Bali. The people on Bali look much different than the Javanese. Their faces are whiter, and men as well as women have much stronger looking bodies. Everybody wears flowers in his or her hair. The women, no matter if they are young or old, walk around with bare breasts. They carry large baskets on top of their heads. This is how they maintain their beautiful posture. Bali has countless Hindu temples, one more beautiful than the other. In front of our hotel was a platform where dances were performed. How different from the Javanese dances these were. Their music has so much rhythm, exhilarating and wonderful. I had an old acquaintance who had lived on Bali for 10 years. Through her we had access to all kinds of different places. Then we returned to the steamboat to travel back to Java once again.
On December 27th, Florentine and Wim would be received by the entirety of the National Youth Storm of the West Indies. The NSB in the Dutch West Indies, Florentine estimated 90% of the youth being mixed race, but they were all staunch supporters of the monarchy and completely loyal to Holland.
Them and I, being guests of honor, walked up front, followed by the standard bearers, along with long ranks of uniformed NJS members. After the march, the governor gave an emotional speech. He officially welcomed us and told us how important contact between the organization in the Netherlands and the NJS was, especially in view of all the different problems in the Dutch East Indies.
She would continue.
In the evening we watched a film about the Papuans of Dutch New Guinea, made by Comrade Harding himself. The leading woman spoke about the goals and principles of our Jitstorm and then introduced our movement song. Now it was Bim's turn to show his film about our marches, demonstrations, and gatherings at the Goudsburg in Lunteren. The film was a great success. Finally, we showed a film about the Bund Deutscher model and the Hitlerjugend, which we had brought with us. The evening was concluded by a speech of the governor who reminded us that the most important things in the Jitstorm were order and discipline, which had to be respected if men and women were to be good patriots later on. My brother and I received an impressive spear as a present in remembrance of the NJS in Sukabumi. Finally, I had the great honor of lowering the flag.
Florentine and Wim would celebrate Christmas with their family. They would return to Dolph's home, where he would offer Florentine a job as a teacher, teaching the children of the European employees at the rubber plantation. She would receive her own home and a good income. Florentine would meet with the supervisor of the plantation. They would speak briefly, and Florentine would accept the job offering.
It was especially interesting for me to own a house in the middle of the jungle and to have enough free time in the afternoons to go for long walks and to explore. The paths in this jungle were quite narrow, only between 1 and 2 meters wide. Since the vegetation on the sides of the path was very dense, wild animals also used these paths quite often. Confrontations were therefore sometimes inevitable.
And inevitable the confrontations would be. Florentine would write about an encounter she had after she was living there.
One day as I was walking along, I heard a thundering noise that was followed by loud, trumpeting sounds. It was a large elephant herd. I realized that I was in danger and did not have a choice but to hide in the bushes until they were gone. In my haste, I got tangled up in thorn bushes and had to muster unbelievable patience to free myself, even though I heard the elephants coming closer and closer. Finally, as I was ready and hiding in an opening in the bushes, the elephants came thundering along the path. They stood still for a moment and then, luckily for me, went on their way. A similar incident occurred when I was following a tapir track, hoping to find some of these good-natured animals. I must have been careless, because all of a sudden I was about 10 meters away from a large Malay bear. He immediately got ready to attack, which did not leave me any choice but to shoot him. 1 meter in front of me, the animal fell to the ground, bleeding. Such things should not happen too often, as otherwise one would not explore a jungle for very long.
Florentine would complete her job duties, and her time on the plantation had come to an end.
Dr. Bartels, Dr. Frank, and I had received an order to travel through all the nature reserves to shoot those animals which were sick. These trips were very exciting and interesting for me. I learned a lot about the jungle, the animals, and also about myself. Never before did I have 2 men weave a hammock for me out of leaves and branches, in which I slept like a queen. Because of all the wild animals, it was too dangerous to sleep on the ground. Our first destination was the reserve for wild banteng cows, whose bulls stay together in large herds. These animals were far from harmless. Shortly after our visit, another researcher was attacked by a bull and killed as the horns pierced through him. We did have to shoot a few bulls because they had an infected bladder disease.
Florentine would accept a position at the Bangyang Zoo, but it would only be effective after 4 months, which allowed her time to visit Japan, return to Holland, and tell her parents about the decision to permanently move to the Dutch Indies. Florentine's travel plans were already booked. When she was set to depart, she wouldn't be able to.
I suddenly received notice that the ships had been requisitioned for refugees, Jews, that is. They wanted to disembark in Britain but were refused entry there, and thus the ships were left fully occupied.
This left her no option but to reroute. She would have to travel by car across Sumatra, and this would be a great trip.
I was welcomed with great cheer by the obliged family, the local assistant resident. Carried away by their enthusiasm, the whole reception got completely out of hand. Escorted by my friends, I was finally brought on board the ship.
While upon the ship, Florentine would wave goodbye to the family as the ship began pulling away from the dock. She would notice all of her luggage was never loaded onto the ship, leaving her with only 1 small suitcase for a 3-week trip. Word would quickly travel around the ship about the young Dutch lady who lost her luggage.
Within a few hours, I received all kinds of clothes on loan from the other passengers, coats, underwear, and, most importantly, evening gowns.
Wim would pick up Florentine's luggage in Genoa, Italy, while he was there with Wartime Rost van Tonningen, a close friend and ranking NSB member. Wartime would begin asking Wim about Florentine, and if they could meet when Florentine landed in Italy. Wartime, Wim, and Florentine would all drive back to Holland together. Wartime was enamored with Florentine.
I myself was too full of all the different impressions of the past months. The return home, seeing mother and father after all this time, the political situation and the intensity of all the events taking place, all of this had precluded the idea of a deeper relationship with a man from entering my mind. Besides, the whole situation wasn't that easy. My brother and I represented the folkish idea in Holland, while Rost van Tonningen came from the League of Nations, the opposite side. Even though he held exactly the same views, he didn't belong to our circle. Moreover, he was much older than me and a born orator, surrounded by many admirers. And there was so much more to do. I had another pressing concern, my career plans in the East Indies. Because of the difficult political situation in Europe, I had already requested a little extra time, something that was not received all that well. In short, circumstances were enough to make my head spin.
Florentine and Wim would arrive back at the Sunshine House. She'd be happily greeted by her parents, giving both of them a hug. She'd thank them for allowing her the freedom to travel and trusting her to do so.
Just think about my adventurous trips to the jungles of Sumatra and my journeys to Japan and China. All this at a time when girls were often deprived of a chance to do such things. What trust my parents had in me. Surely they must have asked themselves if they had made the right decision. But they let me have my freedom. Just think what dangers I had been in, all the things I had seen and done without truly realizing the risks. But now my parents knew what deep feelings of love, respect, and gratitude I had for them and let me thank them for everything.
When she returned home, friction had already been building between her and the NSB. The NSB wanted Mussert to pursue policies more in line with Adolf Hitler.
We, too, wanted to create healthy conditions for our people. We wanted to remain true to our old values and to those standards developed over the course of centuries, and thus avert all destructive influences, whether they came from the capitalists or the communists. Were these thoughts really so wrong? Was it not, rather, seen from my position as a biologist, the only healthy way one could take?
She would write a long letter to Mussert, expressing her concerns. and stressed her respect for the ground the NSB had made. But she had some very serious concerns over race relations. She believed the NSB couldn't be called a Dutch group since so many members were of mixed race. Mussert didn't see a problem with this, but Florentine believed this was simply because he wanted numbers more than anything else. This would be a deal breaker for Florentine, and she would cut ties with the NSB. Wim was in a leadership position of the youth storm. He would ask for Florentine's help in building a girls' branch, which focused on racial hygiene and nationalism.
We admired Adolf Hitler, the Führer, and all that he had achieved in such a short time. We thought of him as a great statesman and envied Germany because of him. Were we not kinsmen, one great family, people of the same race, the same nature, connected by the bonds of blood? We thought we had to walk hand in hand, live and fight the good fight together, and to struggle together against everything and everyone threatening our lives and happiness.
In 1939, the NSB was successfully being suppressed, and any news from Germany was instead routed through TASS, Reuters, or other foreign publications. All the Dutch newspapers received their news about foreign countries through the AMP Press Bureau in Amsterdam. If something happened in London, it passed on information from Reuters. From Moscow, the information supplied by TASS.
In early 1939, things finally started to change. Meinoud had, with the help of his newspaper Het Nationaal Dagblad, the National Daily, managed to make one of the ministers resign, to quietly get rid of 2 pastors, and to secure the prosecution of a well-known businessman who had been waging a reign of terror in the south of the country. There was a lot of criticism about the methods employed by the newspaper. It was said to be sensationalist and disgraceful. But we proved that this was the only way to get through to a sleepy nation. At 1938, the wall that had been built around our paper by the Democrats was breached, and it was widely read by working people outside our organization. In contrast to a thoroughly bourgeois democratic press, the fancy words of Democrats and churches dabbling in politics, as well as the sleepy stories of the once so feisty leftist Arbeiderspers, workers' press, the National Socialist press now spoke in a different tone, without lies and distortions.
Florentine, Wim, and Meinoud began forging a close relationship with the National Socialists in Germany. As the leader of the girls' branch of the Youth Storm, she would meet with Heinrich Himmler.
I was very surprised to feel someone tapping me on the shoulder, and as I looked up, I saw Heinrich Himmler standing right in front of me. I jumped up and apologized, but he smiled and asked me into his office. He talked to me for an hour, explaining his ideas about the girl as a woman in the process of formation, and how they were at the heart of every nation.
Hitler groeide en uiteindelijk had ik een hele ploeg meisjes onder me. En ik werd uitgenodigd door Himmler om naar Berlijn te komen met 100 meisjes, om te zien hoe een meisje moet zijn in de huidige sociëteit, de huidige wereld. En het medesysteem was uitermate boeiend. En zo ging ik terug. En zo was mijn broer Wim bezig met de jongens.
In an interview, she would also be asked about Heinrich Himmler.
He was the only man who impressed me, perhaps even more than Hitler, if that makes sense. I am a follower of the SS writers, so I was impressed. He was an upright leader who was very intelligent and open-minded. Being with Himmler was like being with a teacher. He repeatedly pointed out things that made sense and encouraged us to think about life and life afterwards. He was also very human. You can say a lot about a human being when you see how to deal with insects. Once I talked to him with a tea, and a honeybee landed in a bird's potions. Himmler was frustrated that the bee could not escape from the water, so he continued to speak, but put his finger in the water so that the bee could crawl around on it, then put it on a dry stone so that it could collect and fly away.
Drifting closer to Germany, Florentine and Wim would have discussions about what they would do if the Netherlands was dragged into a war with Germany. They were split. They were fully in line with Adolf Hitler and National Socialist Germany, but as she would write, how could we remain sympathetic to Germany if our own country should become involved in a war with that nation? In this question, they'd soon be forced to answer whether they wanted to or not. On September 2nd and 3rd, Britain and France would declare war on Germany. Holland would declare itself neutral in the conflict, but the Dutch troops were quickly being mobilized.
From the beginning, it was clear that this was to be an ideological war in Europe. It was the collision of two worlds, about which Mussert had already spoken at the beginning of the year. Sections of the Dutch population had become anti-German, thanks to a continuous and biased public enlightenment about the nature and purpose of National Socialism, and thus even more pro-British and pro-French. Our Anglo-Saxon attitude was displayed in sympathy for the leading war powers. The government in the Netherlands could not hide its pro-British feelings, despite the fact that the Dutch were supposed to be neutral.
Dolf would be recalled to the military. He was placed on active duty as captain, and Florentine would assist in medical duties at the Anna Clinic. Meinoud would meet with Mussert before traveling to Germany, where he was to meet with Adolf Hitler in an attempt to avoid war breaking out in the Netherlands.
Dan toch de zekere dreiging, er zou wat iets kunnen gebeuren met Nederland. Nederland was neutraal. En mijn man is dus is gegaan naar Hitler. Mocht er iets gebeuren, wij in Nederland zijn neutraal. Vergeet ons kleine landje. Vergeet ons, kom niet binnen.
Florentine would be highly skeptical of the Netherlands staying truly neutral. Meinoud would begin giving speeches around the Netherlands. One day he noticed an increase in police presence at his speech in Rotterdam. After this, Meinoud began noticing the police trailing him for days. On May 3rd, everything would change. Florentine's skepticism would be confirmed. Meinoud would be arrested in front of his home in The Hague, along with others. He and the others would be taken to an island where they were all to be sent to England.
During this time, his mother received telephone threats every night, saying things like, "Your son has been killed. Your son is dead. We hung him this morning." This often happened between 30 and 40 times a night.
The Netherlands misleading their neutrality would disrupt the extradition plans. On the first days of the German invasion of the Netherlands, a German U-boat would sink the ship that was to be used to extradite Meinoud and the other men. Meinoud and the other men would spend around 36 hours still in custody, while the Dutch forces that were holding them tried to push back the German invasion. But they would be overwhelmed and Germany would take the prisoners. Germany quickly overwhelmed all the Dutch forces, and the Germans successfully took control of the Netherlands.
Norway and Denmark had staked their survival upon the strictest interpretation of neutrality to escape the war. Their sympathies were with the Allies, but they took extraordinary precautions to avoid offending Hitler. On May 9th, Hitler invaded Holland and Belgium. Simultaneously, the Nazis smashed across Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and formal negotiations for surrender were duly completed.
Meinoud would meet with Rommel, where he'd request a marching order back to the Netherlands. Rommel would give him paperwork for him and the other prisoners, but he was told that he had to organize a way home by themselves.
Werd een man 10 dagen voordat de Duitsers binnenmarcheerden, werd hij versleept. Hij werd gevangen genomen met de ene en de andere en versleept naar Zeeland en Oortgansplaat. En van daaruit moest hij eigenlijk naar Engeland gebracht worden. En dat ging dus niet. Rommel trok snel op. Rommel die had grote voorsprong. De Nederlanders die trokken dus naar boven toe en ze moesten dus naar Calais. En daar is mijn man bevrijd doordat hij aan Rommel de torpedring kon laten zien die Rommel hem toonde en hij wist wat het was. En zo is hij teruggekomen in Nederland. Is gewoon weggesleept om in Engeland gevangen genomen te worden. Ja, dat stond vast. Maar door de grote opmars van Rommel ging dat niet. En ze heeft hem naar Calais toegebracht. En van Calais uit stond al een grote boot klei. Maar een voltreffer viel op die boot, zodat die boot zonk. En de man met levensgevaar is bij Rommel terechtgekomen en heeft de geleider teruggekregen. En toen waren de Duitsers dus in Nederland.
Heinrich Himmler would organize a search for Meinoud and the other men. Their search would bring them as far as the Zeeland province, but they couldn't go any further because they couldn't cross the Belgian border. Not knowing what was happening, they started to believe the British had taken the men out of the country. This is when everything began to escalate. Werner Lorenz would be sent to Holland directly by Heinrich Himmler to search for them. Lorenz would tell Mussert that he had orders to shoot British officers if Meinoud was deported, injured, or killed. From there, an entire SS detachment would be sent out to look for the men. In late June, Meinoud would appear. He would receive a letter from a journalist saying,
Dear comrade, just heard about your safe return at a press conference.
At this time, I want to take the opportunity to send you a heartfelt welcome. What a relief. From the bottom of our hearts, we hope you have got out of this hellhole unscathed, both internally and externally. My wife also sends you her kindest love. Your imprisonment has been a shock to us. It made us miserable for days. There will be a run on you from all sides. I would suggest that you gain some distance and be sure to test the waters first. In these few days since the outbreak of the war, many things have changed, even among the Germans. All kinds of new gatherings and groups are forming. Everyone is waiting for Rost van Tonningen. It is now a fact that you will have to take on an enormous task for the sake of the Netherlands. Really, half the nation has been waiting for your return. You have probably been more popular during your time in prison than ever before.
With the German occupation, Meinaud was in prime position to oust Musser and take control of the NSB. Heinrich Himmler would stop in the Netherlands on July of 1940 to meet with Meinaud and congratulate him on his freedom and introduce him to Arthur Seyss-Inquart. The three would talk over plans for the Netherlands. Himmler believed Musser wasn't the right man. He even asked Arthur if he thought Meinaud would be the right man for the job. Heinrich Himmler was set on having Meinaud be the leader, even printing flyers they planned to airdrop declaring him the new leader. But Meinaud remained loyal to Musser. He would turn down this opportunity. Arthur and Himmler would insist that he took the position, but he would again refuse. They were disappointed by his decision, but ultimately understood and accepted it. Himmler would offer him another position as the SS leader in the Netherlands.
Duitsland gaat naar Rusland toe en de groep gaat terug naar Nederland. En dan moeten we dus iets doen met Duitsland. En mijn man, die wordt dan gevraagd of hij de leider wordt van Nederland. Want mijn man zei nee, Mussert is al de leidinggevende man. Want hoofd van SS, Nederland, dat hoort onder jongeren, mijn broer Wim. En dan komt...
This would give Himmler something to think about. As they continued to talk, Meinaud would lay out his economic views and his proposed budget plan for the Netherlands.
De vraag, wilt u president-minister worden? Mijn man zegt gaarne, dat doe ik graag, economisch gezien. En het was het idee, speciaal van mijn man, om dus aan Duitsland te tonen, aan Hitler, dat we op gelijke voet, op gelijke hoogte stonden als Duitsland. Dus niet onder ons hek, we waren niet overmeesterd door Duitsland, maar kameraden van Duitsland. En alle andere landen ook, dat ze gelijk recht tot economisch geheel hadden. En dat hebben we.
In March of 1941, Meinaud would give his speech as the new president of the Bank of the Netherlands. Florentine and Meinaud were becoming inseparable around this time.
We were of one mind. Still, the situation was difficult. I felt that some people thought of me as a traitor when they saw me together with Rost van Tonningen. My brother Wim was very happy about our deepening friendship.
She would continue.
Then, on a beautiful day in the dunes near The Hague, Rost van Tonningen asked me, "Florlor, will you be my wife?" The honesty, the sincere love, and the charm that he put into this question confused me. I wanted to be his wife with all my heart, but wasn't the age difference too great? Then there was the rumor that there was some East Indian blood in the Rost van Tonningen family. And, on top of all this, I had come into conflict with Mussert after my return from the East, causing me to leave the party. All this went around my head. My God, what was I to do? In my mind I could already hear Meinaud saying, "Florlor, do you really find this question so difficult to answer?" I wanted so much to throw my arms around him and tell him, yes, yes, what could be more wonderful than being the wife of such an impressive man? But then, on the other hand, I had had all this trouble with Mussert. What was he to think of all this? Meinaud sensed my inner struggle. Softly, I heard his voice, "Florlor, I will take you to the heritage of my ancestors. The mighty call of their national spirit will excite you. Come, I will show you all of them." So we wandered through the gallery of his ancestors, noble, splendid men and women, dedicated Dutch citizens. What a treasure. We felt as one, even our age difference did not matter anymore. But there still remained one question for me to ask. "Meinaud, since you are Mussert's deputy, and I left the party because of some differences of opinion I had with Mussert, so, what are we going to do now?" I had not even finished talking when Meinaud burst into laughter, exclaiming, "What, Florlor, you left the party because you didn't agree with Mussert? This has to be the best joke I've heard in a long time. This is absolutely amusing." He kept laughing, slapping himself on his knees. From one moment to the next, we were the happiest people in the world. Nothing could come between us any longer. Our fate was sealed. Ours was the way of love and truth on earth. We were sharing a cosmic bond into eternity.
Maynard would call Himmler the next day and tell him that him and Florentine were getting married. Himmler would make them both promise that they wouldn't tell anyone, even family.
Then SS leader Kranefuss intervened. This well-known watchdog of Himmler kept getting in my way all the time, causing me much aggravation. I was hardly allowed to see Maynard at all. I had to get his permission first.
This was completely unexpected for them. They would finally receive a message.
Everything is in order. Congratulations. Signed Heinrich Himmler.
Dat ik uit de geschriften dan?
Nee, het is zo dat als je dus bij de SS hoorde, dan moest je althans weten wie je ouders waren, wie je grootouders waren.
Ja.
En dat vind ik een heel juist iets. Want bij beesten, als bij honden of bij koeien hebben alles, heb je altijd een stamboom. Waarom mogen wij mensen niet weten wie onze ouders, wie onze grootouders zijn, wat onze ziekten zijn voor onze ouders of grootouders, waar we zelf mee moeten rekenen. Dat is een volkomen juist iets. En mijn man, dat was nieuw voor ons om het allemaal uit te graven. We zijn tot 1600, hebben we onze stamboom daarna onderzocht en gevonden. En het is reusachtig leuk werk. Het is geweldig boeiend iets is het. Geweldig leuk.
Before the wedding, a large celebration would be held at the Sunshine House.
Why did we get married on this particular date? On this day in old Germanic tradition, the victory of light over darkness is celebrated. On this day, the sun reaches its lowest point, and then gets stronger and stronger with every new day. Those of us who are in touch with cosmic events experience the victory of light over darkness every year anew. My husband and I always felt connected with this cosmic event. It was very meaningful to us that we melded into one on this very special and important day.
They would be taken to the Hilversum town hall where the ceremony was held. The guards of honor were from the youth storm, along with SS men and the entirety of the NSB, led by Mossert. They would sign all the paperwork before heading to the Palace Hotel, where they would shake hands with thousands of people. This wedding would make history as the first SS wedding in the Netherlands, and was oversaw by Heinrich Himmler himself.
Yeah, it was a big marriage, of course. Yeah, we had a lot of people to go and I too.
Oh. Did any of the German leaders attend your wedding? Well,
Yes, Himmler has attended our wedding, and Harder was there, and of course he gets proud of all and congratulations from Hitler and all these things that happened on our wedding day.
Wanting to make this day a truly memorable moment for their daughter, Florentine's parents had workers completely make over the Sunshine House before they had returned, and had it made over into a true paradise.
My parents, my wonderful mother-in-law, family members, friends, acquaintances, bridesmaids, everywhere one could see happy faces and flowers, a sea of flowers. Then there were the letters, telegraphed messages, and many best wishes. But above all, there was the intensely happy face of my husband Maynard. Beautifully decorated white coaches, with smartly dressed coachmen, rode up and away. What an ovation, what camaraderie, how my husband was honored, how sincerely everyone wished him well. After everyone was seated, the sliding doors were opened. There stood the Zapparoni Quartet. As their opening piece, they performed Andante from Quintet Opus 29 in A-flat by Schubert. After this, the wife of Nico de Haas sang Liebesbotschaft, Message of Love, also by Schubert. Then Nico himself gave a speech, followed by Henk Weimer singing Wagner's Gebet der Rienzi. This was followed by a speech by SS leader Rauter, who presented us with a Gelukter, a candle holder that is a symbol of life in the SS. Finally, the quartet performed a chorale by Bach. After this first part of the celebration, we enjoyed a wonderful dinner, enlivened by numerous speeches given by my father and also by my brother Ben Feldmeyer, and other friends and family members. A feeling of warmth engulfed us. But the nicest speech was given by my husband himself. First he extended praise to my parents, then thanked his mother for all the love she had given him. He then addressed my grandmother, who was having a wonderful time, sitting with Rauter, Feldmeyer, and my cousin Jan van den Bosch, all in SS uniform. My grandmother relished all the warmth and happiness. She was not at all in favor of our ideas, but that did not bother her now. On the contrary, she thought it was great. Finally, my husband turned to me and thanked fate for having given him such a wonderful wife. He made a vow to do everything in his power to bring as much warmth and love into our Sunshine House as he possibly could.
They would leave the Sunshine House and got on a train to Berlin, where they'd receive an even bigger surprise. Organized by Heinrich Himmler, they were greeted by a grand delegation and had a reception at the Hotel Aldon, but the biggest surprise was yet to come. Florentine would be approached by Adolf Hitler. He would take her hand and wished her luck.
What an aura surrounded this man.
Ik vertel persoonlijk degene die Hitler ken, ik heb persoonlijk deze ring heeft dan Hitler gekust. Dat is erg belangrijk.
Hitler heeft die ring
gekust, ja, precies.
Hoe was Hitler?
Een fantastische man.
The next day the newlyweds would go to Munich, where they'd be welcomed by Himmler's confidants. They would take them on a horse-drawn sleigh to Himmler's personal log cabin in Velp, where they would stay for 2 weeks. They would return home to the Netherlands, and Meinoud would deliver a speech as the president of the Bank of the Netherlands on March 20th, 1941. The director of the bank, Jan Robertson, declared Meinoud's speech to be a work of art. On November 1st, 1941, the couple would welcome their first child to the world, a son they would name Meinoud Grimbert.
We received many congratulations, letters, telegrams, flowers, and gifts, among them a beautiful painting from Hitler, depicting an eagle floating above the mountains, and a Lebenslichter from Himmler. We also received a wonderful card from Karl Wolff. Wolff, SS troop leader and Lieutenant General of the Waffen-SS, Chief of the Personal Staff of Reichsfuhrer SS, will be the godfather, best wishes and Heil Hitler. Yours, Karl Wolff. Along with this card came an SS sponsorship set of silverware and a beautiful sponsorship cup.
With this great celebration, the war was still in full swing. Many would still come by and pay their respects to Florentine and Grimbert before departing to the front.
The next day of Brans van Houten. He came in SS uniform, with a single rose in his hand. He put the rose in the cradle, saying, "Dear Grimbert, I am leaving for the front to fight Bolshevism. I am fighting for you, your father and mother, and for all of Germania. Heil Hitler."
3 months after his visit with Florentine and Grimbert, Brans van Houten would be killed on the Eastern Front. Not long later, Wim would be promoted to SS Obersturmführer of the Germanic SS, as well as receiving an Iron Cross for his combat on the Eastern Front. On December 14th, 1941, the NSB would be recognized as the only National Socialist group in the Netherlands, and Mussert would pledge his allegiance to Adolf Hitler. On May 17th, the SS men of the Netherlands would swear their allegiance to Adolf Hitler in front of Heinrich Himmler.
Diesen heiligen Eid, dass ich dem Führer des Deutschen Reiches und Volkes, Adolf Hitler, dem Oberbefehlshaber der Wehrmacht.
An agreement would be reached between Meinoud and Adolf Hitler that Meinoud's oath to Hitler would come before his oath to Mussert. From then on, Meinoud would sign off all of his documents with, "as long as Hitler is alive." In the beginning of 1942, the war in the Netherlands along the coast was getting messy. Scheveningen and the western part of The Hague had to be evacuated. Florentine, Meinoud, and little Grimbert would have to evacuate from their home and go to Florentine's grandmother's home. Resistance fighters would also assassinate many top-ranking NSB members.
Luitenant-generaal Seyfarth, leider van het Nederlands Vrijwilligerslegioen, is door moordenaarshand getroffen als soldaat voor het vaderland gevallen. In de vroege ochtenduren van de dag van de plechtige begrafenis trekken eindeloze rijen langs de katafalk, opgesteld voor de ridderzaal op het Binnenhof. De leider dankt den gevallene voor zijn onbaatzuchtige inzet en zeide: "Uit naam van de oude strijders der beweging zijn wij, zoals gij generaal, bereid ons leven te geven voor ons ideaal, de herrijzenis van ons vaderland." De Weermachtsbefeelshaber brengt de laatste groet der Duitse Weermacht. Groepenführer Rauter legt een krans van de Rijksführer SS. De krans van den Führer wordt door de Rijkscommissaris op de baar neergelegd. In zijn afscheidswoord zegt hij: generaal Seyfarth is opgegaan in de gelederen van die mannen die in deze wereldbeslissende strijd voor ons allen den weg naar de toekomst bereiden en ons voor altijd als voorbeeld zullen voorgaan. Daarna wordt het stoffelijk overschot van generaal Seyfarth plechtig naar zijn laatste rustplaats gebracht.
Meinoud and Florentine were at the top of their kill list. The NSB would station guards outside of their house for this reason. But the day after the guards were stationed there, Mussert would call Florentine and ask why they had a picture of Adolf Hitler on their mantle instead of a photo of him. When Meinoud heard what would happen, he would kick the NSB guards from the property. Instead, they would have the SS leader handle their protection. The SS men were extremely protective. Too protective. Every 2 hours, 12 men would come in their house and search every room. Florentine would call the SS leader and tell him that it was too much. A couple days later, there was an official decree that every high-ranking official would be assigned a bodyguard. Florentine and Meinoud would receive 8 bodyguards because they were number 1 and number 2 on the resistance kill list, and they would all be given shotguns for their protection. But the war was raging. The Allies were increasing their airstrikes across Europe. All of The Hague was ordered to be evacuated. Florentine, Meinoud, and little Grimbert would have to move to Amsterdam. These would be extremely trying times. Under constant air raid sirens, bombs exploding in the distance, Meinoud having to divide his time between The Hague, Amsterdam, and other cities. On top of this, Florentine was pregnant again. Meinoud would write a letter to his unborn child.
If everything happens as is written in the stars, our child will be born under the sign of Leo, between July 22nd and August 23rd. Father and mother read a book together, the book of your ancestors, where their restlessness is so very well described, the seaman who traveled to America, the privateer who commandeered his ship, the generals who fought in South Africa, India, and the Dutch East Indies, the rebellious Scottish officer who stood up against an order of the States of Holland, of which he did not approve, Colonel Licht van Tonningen, who fought in Napoleon's Guard of Honor at Saragossa, Major Rost van Tonningen who defended the town of Breda against the enemy, and the General Rost van Tonningen who was honored for 2 hard-won military campaigns at Atier and Lombok. These are your ancestors, dear child soon to be born and pioneers, restless people who happily gave their fruit for the greatest fight that Germania ever fought.
On August 23rd, 1943, Florentine and Meinoud welcomed their second son Ibi to the world.
That evening we heard that on the Eastern Front, the city of Kharkov had been abandoned by German troops. The fight for Germania continued. Here behind the lines, new life was born. We all felt that victory or defeat depended on all of us. Ebi was born under the sign of war. May he grow up to be a brave warrior.
Times were getting even harder, but the family was getting by. Meinoud would write the following in his diary.
The war has been going on for 4 years now, and the end is still not in sight. Ebi, our second war child, is growing up with his brother Grimbert in relative peace. The Germans are enduring all the air assaults and are waiting for the Führer to strike back. Florrie and I are happy. Führer is protecting our children from the bandits in London and Washington and from Bolshevism. 2 days later we were in Berlin to attend a memorial service for 2 of our NOC leaders, killed by partisans at the Eastern Front. We had to hold the service in the basement of the Bristol Hotel. The rest of the building was completely destroyed by bombs. When we returned to Holland Nijmegen, Holland's oldest city had been totally and senselessly destroyed by American aerial bombardment. Dear youth, never forget the men, mostly Germans, who have protected you from these murderous bandits. Become men and fighters for the greater Germanic community of nations.
On September 17th, 1944, a general railway strike would be announced. This strike meant no coal, no gas, no electricity, no food, no running water during the winter months.
Starvation was the immediate result. When news of the terrible famine reached London, the exile government considered stopping the strike. But in October 1944, Radio Orange announced that it had to continue.
Under the bed in their guest bedroom.
After months of planning throughout the summer of 1944, Allied forces made one of the largest commitments yet seen during World War II. Beginning on September 17th, in a two-pronged attack, Operation Market Garden was launched by both air and ground units, moving east through the Netherlands. The air attack was the largest airborne operation in World War II, delivering roughly 30,000 men from the British 1st Airborne Division, 82nd Lowland Infantry Division, Polish 1st Airborne Division, and American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. The ground assault consisted primarily of the British 30 Corps and was initially spearheaded by the Guards Armored Division. Airborne divisions would join the 30 Corps in the breakout from the Arnhem bridgehead, while the road to Arnhem would become known as Hell's Highway to the men who fought during the operation. While the impact of Market Garden was felt throughout the war effort, the operation ultimately failed to achieve its main objective of gaining control of the Rhine River, resulting in the final withdrawal of Allied forces from the Rhine on September 25th.
One's water supply. Wells were dug, and filters were sold to make the river water drinkable. Carbide lamps were used instead of electric light. Garbage cans were stolen and made into furnaces. There was no more coal for anyone to burn. Trees were chopped down. In Amsterdam, Bondale Park was closed off to keep its trees from being stolen. Beds were burned, along with window frames, doors, planks, and poles. Floors and staircases were taken apart. Driven by hunger, thousands of people went on long treks through ice and snow to the eastern provinces of Gelderland and Overijssel. On the way, many died. Everywhere one could see people, exhausted by undernourishment, resting beside the road. Farmers asked for more and more valuable goods for their beans, peas, wheat, milk, and butter. On the way home, one had to be careful not to be caught by the police.
While the population was starving, Allied air attacks were killing thousands. Towards the end of December, Mainaud would meet Hitler and Himmler. They would bring Hitler up to date on everything happening in the Netherlands. At this meeting, Himmler would repeatedly interrupt the conversation with outbursts about the, quote, third eye, and other esoteric occult things that he had been studying. This would infuriate Mainaud. He would scream in anger. This is all very well, but first the war has to be won before we can chat about the third eye. Florentine was in a nearby room, terrified, believing Mainaud could be killed for such an outburst in front of Hitler. Mainaud would continue. And concerning the NSB, if you want to cut off the dog's tail, you have to do it in one fell swoop, and not bit by bit. We have served your purpose, so now we can go. They would rush home, immediately packing their bags, but they didn't know what to do. They sat for hours trying to figure out their best course of action, believing they could be arrested or killed for what transpired.
At first, my husband was very depressed, but after a while, he regained his composure. I know what I'll do, he said. If I am arrested, I will tell Hitler personally, man to man, how many mistakes the Germans have made in the Netherlands. I'm not going to be pushed into the wrong coma again by intermediaries like Reichsmarschall Göring.
They decided they shouldn't leave and ended up falling asleep, but they would awaken to the doorbell. Immediate fear came over them. Certainly they were going to be arrested, but it was a delivery, a basket of beautiful white flowers, with a tag saying, "Dear Miss Rost van Tonningen, in the name of Adolf Hitler, we thank your husband for his honest expressions, signed Heinrich Himmler."
My husband was so upset, he said, oh, I don't know what now happened. Huh?
Yeah, he figured he blew his stack and the most powerful man in Europe was going to send the Gestapo after him.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
And so then you waited for the moment for the loud knock to come to the door, figuring you were going to be taken to a concentration camp.
So this we thought we had to go away, we put away because my husband was too tired. We just saw all the situation, and then nothing happened. Only I got big flowers, just using the whole situation.
Next morning,
and that was all.
No,
it's very nice.
And the flowers came from whom?
Came from Himmler.
So instead of putting you in a concentration camp, he sent you a huge bunch of flowers with an apology.
A sense of relief and joy would come over the both of them. They'd immediately unpack their bags before returning to work. Florentine and Mainaud maintained their status and influence, with people regularly coming to them for help when they got into bad situations.
Charles Pahad de Montagnes, a cousin of mine, who had been Olympic horse riding champion. His son tried to reach England, but was seized by the German Navy, whereupon Pahad de Montagnes asked my husband to intervene, so his son would not be shot. The same thing happened with my cousin, Jan Vendener van Vlissingen, who was a leader of the resistance and a Freemason. When arrested, Jan asked Router to contact me. Because of my husband's intervention, his life was spared. I have only named these two, because they are family members. It was C.F. Overhoff, a broker on the Amsterdam Exchange who at the end of the war, despite his aversion to the German occupation, begged my husband to take up his offer and escape to Brazil with the children and me. My husband appreciated the offer, but, of course, firmly refused. He knew that he could answer for his actions with a clear conscience, and he wanted to stay on in his position. He asked me whether I wanted to take the children and leave, but I, of course, also refused. Overhoff was highly ranked in the resistance and staunchly opposed Maynard's political views, but saw him as an honest man and held a great respect for him. He practically begged them to leave, believing when the war was over, the Allies would brutally murder him and didn't want to see that.
Through the starvation and aerial bombardments, the worst was still to come for the family.
On January 1st, 1945, my husband and I listened to the deeply moving address of our Führer. He wished his nation strength, directing his speech in particular to the women and children, thanking them for their immense effort. Working hard during the day, at night running towards the shelters with their children, carrying babies, and helping old people, while deadly phosphorus bombs sowed death and destruction everywhere. All able-bodied men were fighting at the front to defend the Germanic lands from the Bolshevik onslaught, having to leave their women and children to fend for themselves, in constant peril of their lives.
It was the middle of winter, 8 degrees below zero. Florentine was again pregnant, and the troops were holding off the Allied advance. Family time would make them forget the hardships.
For my husband and I, it was always wonderful when my brother Ben and we had a musical evening together. I played the piano, then the violin, and my husband sang with his wonderful baritone voice. We felt as though we had escaped all the trouble for a while and had opened all our senses to the music.
On March 16th, Meinau would start his duty with the SS Landstrom, where Wim had served as an officer. Florentine would be appointed special envoy to deliver weekly reports from the bank.
You know how much I love you. You always remained the sun in my life. Please give the children a kiss for Grimbert and Evie, and little Heinrich, who is still in your womb. Imagine yourself in my embrace, because, my dear little wife, we are one, even when we're far apart. If you and the children survive the war, then in my mind I will have already seen them rising from the dead countless times. I know what awaits them if we lose. In my thoughts I embrace you once again, and thank God for having made you cross my path in life. I also embrace my oldest son Grimbert, who never failed in his love for his absent-minded father. And I kiss the good and exuberant Evie, as well as the little one you carry within you. I must go now. Duty calls. With love from me, your husband.
After the final visit with Meinau.
Dus ik heb mijn man bezocht op 30 maart 45 aan het front. En ik kon hem niet vinden voor die boerderij, de waterlinie, alles was onder water, et cetera. En dan is het heel moeilijk vinden. En nou eindelijk vond ik hem dan. En man dacht, ha, nu ben je bij mij. En dan heb je als vrouw de moeilijkheid. De man en ik waren absoluut één. Maar ik had een babytje nog te verwachten. Plus 2 kinderen thuis. En ik zei tegen mijn man, ja, maar in dit geval moet ik voor die kinderen zorgen. Mijn man, dan is het mans eigen. Je bent van mij en we blijven bij elkaar en zo. Ik ben dus wel weggegaan. En die 2 kinderen heb ik gered. Mijn leven is een wonderlijk leven, want ik had de x-maal 100 maal dood moeten gaan. Ik heb alle gekke dingen gereden. Maar je hebt een beschermer waarbij je die ergens je opgave geeft in je leven. Als je dan maar luistert hoe je dat doen moet, dan gaat het goed. Mensen die zeggen, ik ben zeker zo. Maar nu is het natuurlijk zo, dus dat was het punt. Ik heb mijn man moeten laten vergeten voor mijn kinderen.
She would return to their home. It was dark. But Florentine's guard ensured her safe travels. and she would get there safely despite receiving Allied fire. When she returned home, the kids and guards raised their concerns over how close the Polish troops were, and they feared for the lives of the children. They were the only ones there that hadn't evacuated the town. Everyone had already escaped, had been killed, or taken into custody. A terrifying realization. It might be too late to escape.
Florrie, this is Wyatt Rambonnet. I'm calling to find out if you're still at home. It's no longer possible for you to escape through enemy lines. The only thing I can suggest is for you and the children to come to the bridge at midnight. I'll be there myself. Then I'll blow up the bridge, and we'll all die together. It's the best thing to do, better than falling into enemy hands. There are terrible reports about the Polish soldiers.
She would go silent. Weighing her options in an escape mission through the front lines was almost certain capture or death, or taking her lives and the children's lives into her own hands, because capture wasn't a possibility.
My dear Wyatt, thank you so much for your comradeship. You're the only one thinking about me and the children. But I still want to try to cross the waterline to reach the north of the country. If that fails, then at midnight I'll be at the bridge with you and the children.
Florentine would make her escape with the children, taking the Bank of Netherlands car with a wood gas generator, driving through the dark of night on narrow roadways without lights. This would prove to be extremely difficult, but if she turned the lights on, Allied planes would immediately make a gun run on the car. She would make it through, unnoticed by the Allied aircraft, and made it to Haren, in the northern province of Groningen. But there too was a ghost town. Everyone evacuated. She would continue driving, but everywhere they'd reach, there was nobody. She would try to enter a farmhouse, but there was no light, no water, when the car would take Allied fire, but nobody was hurt. She would continue driving west, but all the bridges had been blown up. They would continue driving. They would reach a dam that was passable.
My God, what a terrifying sight. I saw hundreds, if not thousands, of Dutch and Germans, most of them in rags, trying to cross. In the port of Harlingen, many red flags were displayed, and every refugee they could hit was shot in the back. Left and right, the dead and mortally wounded lay in the streets, a sight never to be forgotten. I met some friends and comrades, but no one knew what to do. It was hell on earth.
While all this was going on, Florentine was having heavy contractions. She could go into labor at any time. Making it across the dam, there was a small German naval vessel. She would put the kids on board before closing the boat herself, and they headed for the island of Terschelling. Before they could get there, they would come under heavy Allied fire, and the boat hit a sandbank, which knocked everyone back. A doctor on board would take notice of Florentine. He would take great concern that she was going to go into labor right then, but they would make it to the island.
Het eerste wat we kunnen doen, fiets. Nou, ik had de fiets en 2,5 kind. En ik was een doodsnood in een gosje voor een kind op de straat hier. Hè. En toen heb ik nog wel een kamertje gekregen. Nou, het was nou eens die kamer. En dus daar sliep het ene kind uit het andere kind. In die kamer heb ik het kind gekregen.
She gave birth on her own to their third son on April 28th, 1945. Days later, she would receive a letter letting her know that her brother Wim had been killed in battle on the same day their third son was born. A horrifying revelation of life and death on the same day. With the chaos in the Netherlands, Florentine still had to register the new baby and get his birth certificate. The difficulty she expected. She arrived to the office with a bottle of gin to bribe the registrar, but her just being there would draw much unwanted attention.
Iedereen kende mijn man qua biljet, hè, als van Tonningen. Op 10 gulden, 25 gulden. Dus wat, die vaar en de kind, papa. En dus kwam er allemaal kosten aangezet.
Seeing all the commotion, a German naval doctor would drive up searching for Germans remaining in the area. He would drive his car into the crowd and told Florentine and the children to get in.
In the back of my mind, I recalled that if Hitler were to die, the authorities would issue an order for everyone to gather in Germany. The SS would then be ordered to fight alongside the Anglo-Saxons against the Soviets. Thus my deepest desire was to go to Germany. Perhaps I would even find my husband there. The doctor gave me a poison capsule, in case I should fall into the hands of the enemy.
They would drive to the harbor where there was a German naval fleet and one small vessel waiting for people to board.
Miraculously, I managed to reach this boat with my children. The captain weighed anchor and away we sailed, through the minefields. The German fleet at Terschelling, meanwhile, was seized by the Allies. Was this mere coincidence for our little family? I have always maintained that coincidences do not exist. The Nornen kept our life's threads securely in their hands, showing us the way forward.
Florentine and the kids would escape, but the war was lost. On May 8th, Karl Donitz announced the unconditional surrender of Germany.
The looting spree could begin, in Germany as well as in the other defeated countries. Everything was taken, patents, inventions, and even the inventors themselves. Private property was not spared either, particularly that of German soldiers. Officers were stripped of their insignia. Medals and decorations were confiscated. Papers and documents, fountain pens, and photos of family members were taken as well. All of this was against the Geneva Convention. But the Allies didn't care much about conventions, anyway. When the members of the German government were taken prisoner in Flensburg, they first had to wait for an hour in the hallway of the building. Krosigk and other members of the government, along with General Jodl and the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht, were held under heavy guard. From them, we learn about the events which took place within the government building. The Allies arrived with tanks, infantry, and military police, in a show of force totally out of proportion to the number of people to be taken captive. Shortly after the opening of the government session, British soldiers entered with hand grenades and machine guns at the ready. Hands up and pants down, they ordered. Press photographers were present to capture this disgraceful spectacle on film. Everything was done to rob the members of the German government of all human dignity.
Just days before, forces in Holland would surrender on May 5th. Mainaud would be taken prisoner by Canadian forces. Many years later, Florentine would receive a letter from a reverend that informed her what happened that day.
Dear Mrs. Rost van Tonningen, during the last 3 weeks of his military service, your husband was quartered in our village. Since the commander was billeted in our vicarage, your husband visited him here quite often. This is where you spent his last hours of freedom. From here, he was taken into captivity on Tuesday, May 8, 1945. When he left, he asked me to send one last greeting to his wife and children. He was convinced that he would never see you and the children again. He said, even as prisoners we are marching for the salvation of the world. Tell my wife that I shall endure everything without fear or complaint. His thoughts were always with his wife and children. He asked me to wait a while before sending you this letter. I was also asked to tell you that he took part in the funeral service for your brother Vem. Deeply impressed by his tragic death, I am here with fulfilling his last wishes. The Lord will have mercy upon you and the children. We hope that you will come to say, he remains my sunshine, even when he goes under. All human words of sympathy fail here. With deep sorrow, the Reverend D. Blastbaum.
On June 6, 1945, Mainaud's lifeless body lies below the prison balcony. The official cause of death was ruled as suicide. Under the circumstances, in minimal investigation, it seemed like this was the case. Florentine and the kid would safely board the ship. The constant movement the ship had to do to avoid aquatic mines was so nerve-wracking for Florentine that she would repeatedly lose consciousness, but going to German territory brought her hope.
We experienced a voyage that I shall never forget, navigating through minefields, threatened by warplanes, alternating between hope and despair. I was given a cabin to stay in with my children. It was quite small and cramped. Ebbe and Grimbert got sick right away, and Harry looked so ill that I feared for his life. I tried to breastfeed him, but it didn't make much of a difference, because I didn't have any milk.
The ship would finally land in the harbor of Cuxhaven safely, only to find the entire city was under British occupation and the ship was immediately seized. Nobody was allowed to get off. The captain was very worried about Florentine, and the kids persistently hounded the British to contact a doctor until they finally allowed it. The doctor would arrive in a Red Cross van.
I showed him the paper given to me by the ship's doctor, and this saved our lives. Dr. Dull said that he would help us. It was just in time. Harry was close to death, and so was I. After the doctor had examined us, we went to the hospital, where we were given a room for ourselves. Harry was immediately taken to the infants unit. A wonderful nurse by the name of Cecilia took care of him. We were all gravely ill, but our lucky star was with us, and we recovered. In the infants unit, my baby was the only healthy one. All of the 30 other babies had been infected from birth with venereal disease. It was a terrible sight. That I and my 3 children were still alive was nothing less than a miracle.
En zo, na een paar weken zijn we in Cuxhaven aangekomen. Maar een hele Duitse was gevangen genomen. Hè?
Wat zegt u
in Cuxhaven? In Cuxhaven aangekomen. Toen had ik eigenlijk, was ik zo goed als dood en mijn kinderen eigenlijk ook. We hadden geen eten. Ik moest een kind zacht geven, ik had ook niet meer. En daardoor ben ik uitgeleverd aan het ziekenhuis. Met mijn 3 kinderen, de baby boven de babyafdeling en 2 kinderen bij de kamer. En daar had je al de Engelse, hoe noem je dat? De Engelse...
Military police.
Ja, en die vroeg wie ik was. En in het eerste begin denk je nog dat je eerlijk moet zijn. Dus ik zei mevrouw president. En toen merkte ik al...
They were all in bad condition, but the words of my now would constantly echo in her head.
Now that your father is leaving for the front, be brave, my little one. Goodbye, my dear Abby. Father has to go away. He hopes to see you again soon, when you have got bigger. Harry, my son to be born, you'll be your mother's happiness. Father loves all of you.
The belief she would reunite with my now would constantly be interrupted with horrible, intrusive thoughts.
My parents, my mother-in-law, were they still alive? I didn't know the answer. What was I to do?
Any hope she had of a miracle in Germany would be completely erased when the British realized who she was. A nurse named Cecilia would come in her room at night and tell her the British knew who she was and she was being taken to England in the morning.
Quickly we tied bed sheets together. The children were let out of the window. I followed, and soon we were in the street. I arranged with Cecilia that she should stand in the middle of the street and force to a halt the first truck that came along. We would then climb in the back without being seen. Big American truck drove up. To avoid running over Cecilia, the driver screeched to a halt. Quickly, the children and I scrambled into the back of the truck. After a few curses at Cecilia, the driver continued on his way. Through a narrow opening, I was able to see our dear friend and wave goodbye to her. About 30 kilometers farther on, the truck arrived at a checkpoint, and we were discovered. But everyone was so busy that I just walked away and continued on my journey. But where to go, and how? I felt like an animal being chased, without a home, without a country, without money or family.
She would walk with the kids down an empty roadway of destruction. There were no buses, no trains, no cars. With no plans, all they could do was walk and hope. But a British military vehicle would pull up beside them. She was out of options. There's no way she could run. They would tell her that the area was restricted. Travel was forbidden. She would play stupid and say she didn't know. But she still had a trick up her sleeve. She would pull out the crumbled paperwork from the hospital, which had a stolen English seal.
Mrs. Rost van Tonningen and her children from Deventer, Holland, were admitted to a hospital in Cuxhaven. Mrs. Rost van Tonningen had childbed fever. The newborn suffered from an infection of the digestive system and weight loss, and the 2 older children had bronchitis and fever. Mother and children are well enough to be released from the hospital. Release is necessary because the hospital beds are needed for new patients. Dr. Schilling. Physician in charge. Cuxhaven.
Suddenly one of them asked me in a friendly way, "Where are you going? Do you speak English?" I quickly told them that I did, and much to my surprise, we were allowed to climb aboard the vehicle. I was asked to help them as an interpreter. After a long and bumpy ride, we reached Hildesheim. There, I had to get out right away, because suddenly the soldiers found themselves in a great hurry.
Op een gegeven moment merkte ze dat ik meer zijn fout ging met de auto gooit. En toen zo'n klein kereltje stond op straat. Die zei, "Wat doet u?" Ik zei, "Ja, ik moest naar Goslar toe." En je was gewoon zo'n landloopstertje. Die liep op straat. En zei, "Oh, mijn mommy wil wel dat u kan staan." Een klein jongetje. Dan mij en mijn drie kindertjes. Ik had 1 bed. In Hildesheim was dat. Daar heb ik mogen liggen. Ik was... En mijn kinderen ook. En toen zijn we gewandeld naar Goslar. En daar heb ik net mijn kinderen aan mijn ouders kunnen geven. Reeds de volgende dag was al bekend ik er was. Hè.
Upon waking, they'd catch a ride with a truck to Goslar, where Florentine's family had a home.
Goslar had not been invaded by the Soviets. Would I find my parents and mother-in-law still alive? I felt dizzy as I rang the doorbell at the house of one of my aunts. And guess who opened the door? My brother-in-law Wim. We hugged each other. My mother-in-law was there, as well. Oh, what a joyous event it was.
The joy would quickly run out.
Your father is on his deathbed. Maybe you can get there in time to tell him that you and the boys are alive and well.
I raced with my children to the refugee home in the Frankenberg convent, where my mother and father had been given a room. Leaving the boys outside, I rushed into the room. My mother was sitting at my father's bedside. He was still alive. Slowly, he opened his eyes and looked at me with a long, silent gaze. "Are you still alive?" he asked. "And the children?" Quickly, I let him see the boys. Then a miracle happened. My father's will to live grew so strong that he recovered. We were all together again. But what had happened to my brother Wim and my husband? It was rumored that they had both died. What strength one needed not to lose faith during those difficult times, faith in an ideal, and, most importantly, faith in people.
Arriving in Goslar was a great happiness for Florentine, but also a great pain. The torture of the unknown would eat at her soul.
Was I a widow or not? I was kept in the dark for many years. Someone told me that my husband had jumped out of a 3rd-floor window. Someone else said that they had taken his corpse to such and such place. Suicide yes, suicide no, murder yes, murder no. Still another person told me that he knew for sure that my husband had escaped to Argentina, and I would receive word from him there.
While in Goslar, Florentine would be interrogated by British intelligence about the whereabouts of her husband. He was knowledgeable as the president of the bank, and they needed him for the reorganization of the bank. But this would only remind her of the unknown. The British not knowing his fate, and not having him in custody, only added to the sorrow she was feeling.
It was a comfort to be reunited with my parents in Goslar. What would have happened to me otherwise? My 3 sons had their beloved grandparents. It was a place of security for them. Only now did I realize what dangers my children and I had gone through. And our beloved Goslar was still standing. It hadn't been bombed like almost all of Germany's other towns and villages, with death and destruction everywhere. Just think of Dresden. This city was bombed by the American Air Force during the night of February 13-14, 1945, killing some 480,000 people in 15 hours, most of them burnt alive in excruciating agony. Among them were 37,000 small children and infants, 46,000 children of school age, 55,000 war-injured soldiers, doctors, and nurses, 12,000 members of rescue units, 330,000 elderly men and women. I shall never forget the day I stood alongside a road with my children crying, as I witnessed hundreds, if not thousands, of former German soldiers marching into Goslar to be quartered in the hotels there. They were infested with lice, and many were suffering from edema, covered with sores, with swollen legs and bruised bodies. Poor creatures, poor Germany. In the midst of death and destruction, Goslar stood out like a refuge, offering hope and a certain sense of safety.
A few days later, Florentine would be picked up by a British-Dutch officer, where she was interrogated for another 24 hours straight. At the end of the interrogation, the officer would say,
"I congratulate you and honor you. You were telling the truth, and so I'm going to let you go. But I advise you to leave as quickly as possible. I know the Russians want to get hold of you."
Not long after, Florentine would learn that her oldest brother Dolph had died while in custody of the Japanese in the East Indies. She had managed to avoid complete detainment, but her luck would soon run out.
I was arrested and taken to Holland. After being shifted from pillar to post, I was taken to the custodial camp at Schokwitzk. Each day I had to stand on top of a tower, watching my fellow prisoners as they marched by. Some had only one leg, some had been shot in the jaw, some had arms missing. It was a terrible sight.
The guards would sit Florentine in a room. They would have each prisoner stand on a table in front of her. And if she didn't know their name, the prisoners would be savagely beaten. After the beatings, they'd be forced into a small room lined with barbed wire, horrifically injuring them.
I was called out over the loudspeakers. I walked slowly toward the exit, a small bundle of clothes under my arm and wooden shoes on my feet. There I saw two vehicles, one a prison car, and the other an automobile bearing diplomatic tags. I automatically walked toward the prison vehicle, but was told to get into the other car instead. Inside were two police officers, Leandic and Karsten. They drove me to the Hotel Jan Tabak, near Laren. They had brought a change of clothes for me, as well as some Dutch and German money. When I came downstairs, a sumptuous dinner awaited me. But because I weighed only 98 pounds and had been given hardly anything to eat for so long, I was unable to enjoy much of it.
To her surprise, the two officers would tell her that they followed her husband for a long time.
They knew many amazing things about us, like the time I was playing around with my husband at an antique shop, pulling his hat over his face.
Hours would pass and she'd be brought to a table to sit with many officers, when she'd get a tap on the shoulder and ordered into a Red Cross van, where she was told she was being taken to Germany. They would arrive in Bergsteinfurt, where the two escorting officers would put her on a train. She would be accompanied by the officers until she boarded the train. Then she was sent on her way. She was free. She would make her way back to Goslar.
I got a room at the Frankenberg convent with my children, who had previously been sleeping in the room my parents had been given there.
Knowing her children were safe and being able to see them was a relief. But her happiness would once again be yanked away.
En daar heb ik mij vergalopeerd in de avond. Ik was zo enorm gelukkig dat we even samen waren. En toen is iemand door sleutel gegeven. Toen werd ik van afgehaald door de politie. Toen was ik in de dodenzaal Amsterdam. Hè. En daarop is gekomen, daar heb ik maar 14 dagen gezeten of zoiets.
I had to leave my sons behind. Luckily, they did not wake up. I put a little note in a shoe for my parents, along with a small poison capsule. In the note, I asked my parents to take good care of the children and save the capsule, which the doctor on Terschelling had given me, just in case.
She'd be shoved into another Red Cross van, this time with two badly injured SS men. They were supposed to be getting surgery at the hospital, but they were taken out of the hospital just before their operation.
One had his jaw missing, and the other had lost both legs. The vehicle was securely locked, and we were taken back to the Netherlands. The trip took more than 36 hours, and we were half dead because of a lack of oxygen and the smell of untreated sores. Perhaps they hoped that we would die on the way, so they would then be rid of us.
She was again in custody. She would try to make an escape with a woman friend and go back to Germany, but this would be short-lived.
As we tried to circumvent the border checkpoint, she stumbled, and a bag of coffee beans, which she had hidden in her bra, fell out and spilled all over the ground. I had to continue running, despite my friend's misfortune. Eventually, I too was discovered, arrested, and taken to a farm in the no man's land between Holland and Germany. The commander ordered us to write our names down. He was overjoyed to have captured a Rost van Tonningen and already saw himself getting a big promotion.
With this big promotion in mind, the commander would celebrate too early, opening a bottle of wine and overindulging, before passing out. Florentine and her friend would slowly walk to the door and quietly open it. The guard wouldn't wake up, and the two would make their escape once again. This time they wouldn't get caught, and they would make their way back to Gulsar again.
My parents could not stay in Germany. There wasn't enough money, and I didn't earn very much with my paintings. With one last effort, I was able to arrange for my mother to travel to the Netherlands with my youngest son. My two other sons, meanwhile, were able to travel with a Dutch refugee transport. As for myself, I had to try once again to get across the no man's land. All went well, and we were all reunited in Hilversum at my grandmother's home.
The family was reunited. It was a glorious evening, she wrote. They were the happiest they had ever been in years. But the joy and happiness would cloud their judgment.
I threw all caution to the wind. It was a glorious evening. But it was also to be our last evening together. The next day the police were at the door. My mother was arrested and taken back across the border. She had to undress and undergo an examination of her private parts, because supposedly she might have hidden money there. Besides that, all of her jewelry was confiscated.
Florentine would be taken to Amsterdam, where she'd be held in horrendous conditions. No water, no food, and hardly any fresh air.
Every day, two men claiming to be medics would enter my cell and proceed to examine me in such a way that I eventually lost consciousness. They considered it their daily fun.
En dat was nou een katholieke priester die vond, je lag op de grond en het was ongesteld, het was echt de doodcel, hè. En die vent heeft me eruit gehaald en zo ben ik vrij.
They would keep the bright lights on directly in her face all day and night. After dealing with this day in and day out, Florentine would finally get help from an attorney and managed to get released from custody under the conditions that she had a place to live. She didn't have any family in Amsterdam that would be willing to help her, so she had to work as a housekeeper for one of her husband's distant cousins.
He was an alcoholic, making my stay there an absolute hell. But at least I had a roof over my head.
Things would get progressively worse.
He was in the habit of drinking a whole bottle of gin every afternoon. Then he would try to molest me. After a while, I became so frightened that I called upon a niece of my husband, who lived nearby, for help. After explaining the situation to her, she immediately agreed to help, bringing along my cousin Ben. Together, we thought, we should be able to clear this situation up once and for all. As quietly as possible, we sat in my room. Then we heard the sound of footsteps. The old man called in a soft voice. Then he discovered to his surprise that the door was unlocked. He stuck his head around the door and was about to call my name again, when suddenly he was interrupted by the little terrier my cousin had taken with him. The dog barked madly and charged towards the door. The old man got such a scare that he ran out as fast as his legs could carry him. After that, the problem was solved, and he never tried anything with me again.
The old man would try to get revenge. He would hire a furniture truck and remove all the furniture from her living quarters. But Florentine wasn't one to give in to pressure.
Word got around, and my friends brought some straw for me to sleep, along with a couple of chairs. These were friends and comrades who, like myself, had lost everything and whose husbands were, for the most part, still in prison. By chance, an old NSB comrade called and said that he had found some of my old furniture. He had heard rumors that it was to be picked up in a few days by Mrs. Kruisman and a Mrs. Ballen. He said that he would send a car to take me to Amsterdam. There I found some nice things from our old house. Overjoyed, we packed the furniture into a small van and drove back to The Hague. My possessions now consisted of, among other things, a bed, a pedestal cupboard, a table, and some chairs.
After a long day's work moving, she decided to get some rest. But she would awaken to a car pulling up. It was her sister. But she wasn't there to visit Florentine. She wanted the furniture Florentine had picked up. And she didn't even want it for herself. She was going to give it away to somebody else.
I had already inspected the little pedestal cupboard and found a red braid, which I had cut off a long time ago. Angrily, I told her, "Whom does this hair belong to, you or me? This braid is mine. You should only wish you had such pretty red hair." That was too much for my sister, and she left. She didn't bother me anymore after that.
Despite the difficulties, the ups and downs, no help from family, and making next to no money, the NSB widows would stick together, helping each other in any way they could. With this help, Florentine worked to get her sons back.
With some difficulty, I managed to get my sons to live with me again. My family was back together. How happy that makes a mother feel. Wasn't the world turned upside down when those who loved their country were persecuted and thankful just to have a roof over their head? We had lost everything. We had been robbed. Democracy had become a caricature. Instead of a democracy for the people, we now had a democracy against the people.
And to make some extra money, she began selling artwork, postcards, painted lampshades. She advertised with a card she painted and hung it on her window. Soon she would make the local newspaper headlined, "From President's Wife to Portrait Painter."
Then they said that I was painting lampshades made out of parchment, just as Ilse Koch had made lampshades from human skin, and gone was my good reputation.
She would later be invited to Leiden, where a friend of hers taught graphology, offering her a free course.
I eagerly seized this opportunity to complete previous courses I had taken in that field. After the war, all one ever heard was, Himmler was a demon, Hitler was a devil, etc., etc. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Perhaps I could draw conclusions from their handwriting. Graphology was an eye-opener for me. I learned that my husband's handwriting showed great intelligence. And then there was Hitler's signature, which was a revelation to me. Only Himmler's handwriting brought me into inner conflict.
Going from a wealthy, high-ranking member of society to losing nearly all of her family, friends, imprisoned, tortured, left with nothing, she began to question everything she had known. And then tragedy would strike again.
On March 10, 1947, I received an urgent message, "Mother seriously ill. Please come." With great difficulty, but through the help of my attorney, I was able to go to Goslar, to be with my mother to the end. Life, the greatest of all treasures, had become too heavy for her to bear. The Almighty took pity on her. With tears in my eyes and filled with deepest respect, I parted from her on March 17, 1949. Her life was an example for all of us. My father and I were left behind, which brought us closer together than ever before.
Mijn moeder kon er natuurlijk helemaal niet tegen. Mijn moeder is ook gestorven toen. En nou ja, op een gegeven moment had ik...
Despite this tragedy, her situation became more stable. And now she wanted answers for what happened to her husband. She wouldn't get anywhere though.
Ze heeft helemaal niet gereageerd. Zij van de Leeuw schaamt zich ook. Ik heb zelfs nog niet eens een overlijdensakte. Ik heb geen medisch rapport, ik heb helemaal niets. Bij wijze van spreken zou ik nu nog een man hebben, die misschien ergens in Brazilië zit, weet ik waar. Maar ik heb nog nooit een bericht gehad van de Nederlandse regering, als zijnde dat mijn man president van de Nederlandse Bank was, dat hij overleden is. En door welke omstandigheden. Daar ben ik nog 15 jaar mee bezig. En ik weet wel hoe het nu gebeurd is, door eigen onderzoek. Maar niets van de Nederlandse regering uit. En voor de Nederlandse regering, die moet toch in mijn ogen de verantwoording durven dragen voor de hoogste man van Nederland als er iets misgaat. Het is toch buitengewoon laf als een regering geen antwoord geeft op een hoogpiet, al zou je meneer Jansen heten. Hoeft niet eens onze tonningen, wel je meneer Jansen. Maar je hebt toch je verantwoording. In het gezin draag je toch ook je verantwoording. En dit is verantwoord dragen. De man heeft verantwoord willen dragen. Antwoord, gebeurd, dood.
With the government not cooperating, she began her own investigations.
Almost 3 years later, I found out that his body had been brought from the prison to the municipal hospital on a garbage cart. From all of my possessions, I had been left with just 3,637 guilders, from which they had the nerve to deduct 47.25 guilders for the expense of transporting my husband's body.
Florentine still had no idea about the true horror she would uncover. She would go to the hospital where the death certificate was signed.
The head physician was visibly shocked by my appearance, which brought back to him memories of my husband's remains. He then sent me to the director of the Whitbreak Cemetery, who, he said, would know more about the case. When I asked this man about my husband, he was likewise appalled. He pointed to a row of files, all bearing the inscription, secret, and then took me to the paupers section of the cemetery. There, under a small stone with only the number 19, was a mass grave for 16 people, buried in 4 layers, and all without coffins. In 1949, through my lawyer, Dr. Sasson in Nijmegen, I submitted a request with the court for special jurisdiction to start posthumous judicial proceedings against my husband, thereby enabling me to personally defend him. The reply I received was that there would be no proceedings against my husband, because, so they declared, his means were negative. In other words, he would not be able to pay, anyway.
She would submit a petition to the Queen, asking for the location of her husband's body. She received a letter back from the Queen's office. It said her inquiry was being forwarded to the Ministries of Justice and the Interior. But like her other attempts, it would go unanswered. She had another trick up her sleeve, a very powerful person, the Pope. Florentine would contact Luciana Forsetti, who lived on Vatican territory. Luciana had known Mainauer from the League of Nations, and they agreed to meet. Florentine would travel to Rome, and Luciana would pick her up from Central Station and bring her back to her house.
More than 100 guests were invited, all dressed in the most elegant attire. I myself was given a beautiful, long gown to wear. It was an unforgettable evening, with high society from all over Europe. The party lasted till the early morning hours. It was an exceptionally cold winter, and the mountains around Rome were covered with a thick blanket of snow, contrasting with the warm atmosphere of the party.
2 days later was the big day.
After walking past the Swiss guards in their splendid attire, I was greeted by a chamberlain, who brought me to a little room. Suddenly, a small door opened, and the Pope entered. He beckoned me to come with him to an adjoining room. Then he shook my hand. I had known Hitler's radiant, blue eyes, which were almost hypnotic. But this man had such a penetrating gaze, that it was difficult not to lower one's eyes. Seconds felt like minutes. I made a short speech in German, thanking him sincerely, in the name of all those without rights in our country, who had suffered grievously after the war, for the beautiful words he had spoken at the opening of the Santo Edo for us in Holland. Then the Pope took over. He spoke extensively about my husband, about whom he had an amazing knowledge. I hardly needed to explain a thing. Then he asked me about my sons. How did I expect to raise them? I smiled and told him that I came from a Protestant family and had absolutely no intention of allowing my sons to be raised as Catholics. If this were the price for getting his help in finding out about the death of my husband, I would have to disappoint him. The Pope denied that this was his intention, but said that he wanted to help me on behalf of my sons. After the formal part of my visit was over, we went into another room, where about 20 nuns stood holding rosaries. The Pope proceeded to bless their rosaries, which greatly enhanced the value for them. I couldn't help but notice with some satisfaction that he was not insensitive to feminine beauty, because he bestowed special attention on one exceptionally beautiful young sister. Everyone curtsied, and the audience was ended.
She would return to The Hague where she had a meeting.
He greeted me cordially, and my conversation with him was most encouraging. He said that the Pope had expressed himself very favorably towards me. Monsignor Jabi wanted to help me in clearing up the circumstances surrounding the murder of my husband. He promised to engage himself fully in order to bring this case to a satisfactory resolution. We agreed that I should receive an official declaration in which the murder of my husband would be acknowledged.
Dr. Struycken, the Minister of Justice, would undergo an investigation within the ministry, in an effort to search for any files related to the death of her husband. But her lawyer would notify her of a letter he had received saying,
As long as there is no ruling by the government regarding the existence of a right to compensation for the heirs of Dr. Rost van Tonningen, the Ministry of Justice cannot invoke the statute of limitations. Signed, the Minister of Justice, Dr. Struycken.
In 1951, she would follow up again with the Queen, stating that she hadn't received a reply from the Ministry of Justice and the Interior. This inquiry would again go completely unanswered. She would reach out to the mayor of The Hague, requesting her husband be exhumed, allowing him a proper burial at their family gravesite. This request would be rejected. She would go to the Court of Appeals to challenge this decision, but they would just keep delaying, until one day, she got a response. But not the response she was looking for. The Court of Appeals would inform her that the mass grave that Mainoud was buried in had been completely cleared out. She would again make an attempt to appeal this, but the Ministry of Interior would dismiss her request as groundless. She would continue working tirelessly. She would write, "Following my meeting with the Pope, 3 attempts were made to run me down by automobile." On March 15th, 1951, despite the promises and all the effort put in by Florentine, the new Justice Minister wouldn't write an acknowledgement of the murder of Mainoud. This was a major setback. While this was ongoing, the old man she had been staying with would pass away, making her the main resident of the home. This opened the door for Florentine to allow her father, who was now unable to take care of himself, to move in. However, the Netherlands wouldn't allow this, only allowing him to stay 1 month at a time.
Because his residence permit was good for only 1 month, he had to travel back and forth constantly, between Goslar and The Hague. Nevertheless, we were both very happy, because he meant so much, not only to me, but also to the 3 boys. He was like a father to them.
After months of going back and forth, it was becoming increasingly difficult for her father to travel.
Gradually, my father was no longer able to muster the strength to deal with all the difficulties he faced. One should not forget that he had lost 2 sons, his son-in-law, and then of late, his beloved wife. In addition, his entire property, before the war, both he and my mother had been very wealthy, was confiscated by the Dutch state.
Zoals we de Nederlandse regering gewoon nog niemand gegeven.
Alles beslag hadden. Als ik nu vanochtend nog een Mondriaan zie, een Mondriaan. Wij hadden honderden schitterend gelijk. Alle gegapt, gestolen, geroofd, gedaan. Die ene Mondriaan nu, wat hebben ze gegeven nu? Ik weet niet hoeveel.
After all the pain and suffering, Florentine's father would live his final days happy in her house, passing away from a heart attack on December 22nd, 1952.
My children were getting bigger, and the influence of city life was beginning to make itself felt. We needed a change. When my grandmother died, her house at Rijstraat 216, where my husband and I had spent such a happy time, was to be sold. A friend of mine, who was a real estate agent, persuaded me to go to the auction with him. As a direct heir of the deceased, I had the right to buy the house for the final bidding price. I was very fond of the house and the many memories it held. Nervously, I raised my hand at the last bid, and the house became my property. Of course, I couldn't think about living in it myself. As it turned out, the tenant of this splendid house paid only 100 guilders per month. To me, this didn't mean any financial relief, because the house would cost too much for maintenance.
She would receive another invite from her graphology teacher to attend another lecture. All the attendees would pack in to hear the lecture. While on break, everyone rushed to the coffee stand, making it nearly impossible for her to go get one. A man beside her asked her if she'd like a cup, because he was going to wait in line, in which she happily accepted. After a while, he would return with their coffee, and they would continue their conversation. He would reach into his pocket, pulling out an envelope. The man would ask Florentine about the writing on the envelope. To her shock, it was the address to the home she had just purchased. She would ask him how he had that address, in which he would reply, "That's none of your business. I only asked you to analyze the handwriting." She would tell him that was the address of the home she had just purchased. The man would argumentatively say, "Oh heavens, you must be Mrs. Rost van Tonningen. I don't want to have anything to do with you." The lecture would continue, but her thoughts on what just happened made it impossible for her to focus. When the lecture ended, Florentine and the man had stayed seated while everyone was leaving. They just sat there until nobody was left, before the man would turn to her and say,
"Mrs. Rost van Tonningen, I am Dr. Van Shelven. I am the tenant at your house. Wouldn't it be most sensible to go to Rijstraat 216 right now and talk everything over?"
In which she would agree.
die was dan handschriftkunde, is dat, hè? Dat was dan in, spreek ongeveer, jaar 49 of zoiets. En dan was er een avond en het was stampvol graferie, les, en er zat een man naast me. En jullie die zo'n handschrift zien, was mijn huis. Toen was zo'n 16 in Den Haag. En ik stond van, zo komt hij aan dat adres. En vaak is dit handschrift. Ik zei, ja, ik vraag het adres. Ik zei, het is mijn huis. Zoals de dokter beschouwt, in mijn huis. In de Ruurstraat van onze familie.
A short while later, we were sitting in my house with a glass of wine. Dr. Van Shelven had, in concert with my sister, commissioned a real estate agent to buy the house for him as cheaply as possible, and he felt disappointed that I had thwarted his plan. When I told him that the house was too expensive for me to live in anyway, we came to a surprising agreement. He said, I had been general practitioner in Velp, a small town near Arnhem, but my wife wanted to go back to The Hague. So here I am now. But I still haven't been able to sell my house in Velp. We immediately agreed that he should pick me up the next day, and that we should drive to Velp to inspect the house. Following the inspection, we agreed to a trade. After all the misery of the previous years, I felt it would be a relief to live here, even though the house was worn down quite a bit. He, too, was satisfied and felt that he had got a good bargain.
Toen zei hij, ik heb een leeg huis in Velp, verwaarloosd dan wel, maar dat bied ik u aan.
In ruil voor uw eigen huis. Ja.
En zo ben ik in Velp terechtgekomen. En daar heb ik altijd gewoond.
Months later, Florentine and the kids would move from The Hague to Velp to start over.
As I stood in the doorway of my new house, an old man came by and called to me. Wondering what he wanted, I went out and asked him. The man pointed with his cane to my house and asked, "What's written here on this house?" Even more astonished, I replied, "Ben trovato," which is Italian for well found or well discovered. "Yes," said the man, "but don't you see it's your name which is written there? It was in Velp long before you got here." And the man was right, because Rovato could be interpreted as an abbreviation of Rost van Tonningen. Then he said, laughing, "Yes, but the word Ben means good. There are other Rost van Tonningens in the Netherlands, but I look upon you as the good Rost van Tonningen." Then he took off his hat and disappeared. I never saw him again.
She would inform all of her friends in The Hague that she would be moving away for good, which all of them would express their disappointment.
I, too, felt an inner emptiness. My husband and I had loved this town very much. But what doesn't one do for one's children? They should grow up in a natural environment with plenty of fresh air and sports, not in a big city with all of its temptations.
Despite the emptiness she was feeling, the boys loved Velp. They quickly adjusted to school. They would go to summer youth camps of the Dutch Alpine Association in the Austrian Alps.
My own future was still uncertain. I had gone through too much and kept too many things inside of me. My faith in mankind had suffered. After careful consideration, I decided to establish a small business. This would bring in some money to raise my boys. Besides, it would also provide some badly needed social contacts for me. I called my firm Verena and registered with the Chamber of Commerce. First, I dealt in ceramic animals, deer, elephants, monkeys, and rabbits. Each piece was a pleasure to look at. But, unfortunately, these ceramic figures were so fragile they couldn't be shipped. As a result, there was no money to be made with them.
This would be a minor setback for Florentine in her business venture, but she would be recommended a Belgian firm that was on the verge of bankruptcy. They believed with good management and marketing it could be successful again.
So, wholly unexpectedly, I slipped into the world of engineering, with all its possibilities and problems. What I had previously detested, namely technology, now captivated me no end. I began to take an interest in technical problems, which surprised me most of all. A rundown house on the main street in Velp became mine through a mortgage loan. A woman secretary and a technician were employed part-time. Soon I had to hire additional personnel. Initially, I worked mainly for foreign firms, like the Austrian Hildebrand Company, whose industrial washing machines I sold at a modest stand at the Utrecht Trade Fair. Sales prospered, and everything looked well at the beginning. But then the problems began, motors got damaged, spare parts had to be imported, etc. Import and export permits were needed, entailing a lot of work. In the end, there was hardly any profit left.
A lot of work for minimal profits wasn't cutting it. Florentine would come up with an idea of creating a product on her own.
I developed the concept of a laundry dryer mill to be put up in one's garden. It would rotate in the wind, making the laundry dry faster. The prototype was installed in the garden in front of my office. It was much too heavy and primitive, but it worked, which was the main thing. After a few improvements, my dryer mill was put on the market. I had a skillful young man demonstrate the apparatus at the Utrecht Fair. It was an immediate success. We were all enthusiastic, and large orders followed.
This major success wasn't expected. They quickly ran out of workshop space and had to expand, transferring part of the production line into their garden. In the garden there was a large chestnut tree, which the employees hated, because while they were working, ripe chestnuts would fall down on them. But to remove the tree, she would have to have permission from the municipal office. She would attempt to get approval, but they would deny her request. Her son, Grimbert, would volunteer to climb the tree and cut back some of the problematic branches. This sounded like a good idea, and Florentine would give him the go-ahead. Grimbert immediately climbed the tree and got to cutting.
2 distinguished gentlemen from the municipal office appeared in front of my office and asked to be admitted. They had a paper with them, warning me to leave the tree alone. I invited them to have a cup of coffee and had to promise that I would let it stand. After all the formalities were over, they wanted to look back briefly at the tree. This I allowed them, of course. But what we saw next I shall never forget. My son Grimbert was sitting on top of the tree, sawing away at the branches. The crown was just hanging on the bark and was about to fall down. I was shocked, and the men from the municipal office were furious. I tried to call my son, but he was much too busy and didn't hear a thing. The men went away.
A couple days later, a letter from the municipal office would arrive, stating that the tree needed to be taken down immediately. It was an eyesore now, and she would be fined if it stayed up. Grimbert's mistake worked to her benefit, and she ultimately got what she wanted.
At last, with much effort and loud cheers, the chestnut tree plunged to the ground, partially blocking the street. The police were needed to close the street off to traffic.
This would open the door for her to build a new space, a bigger workshop, so she would submit an application to build, and it was quickly approved. The business thrived, and many Dutch firms sought after selling her product. But Florentine was having problems at home. The absence of a father was causing Grimbert to act out.
Hello, to whom am I speaking? Is that you, Florrie? This is your cousin, Jan Ventiner van Vlissingen. It's been a long time since we last spoke to each other.
Yes, how are you, Jan?
I'm fine, but I heard you've had some difficulties.
Yes, everything hasn't been so easy for me. But what hurts me most is that my oldest son isn't doing so well. My sons lack the authority of a father.
Yes, Florrie, that's just what I wanted to talk with you about. My children have all left home, except for Paul. He hasn't finished school yet. If it's all right with you, I would like to have Grimbert stay with us. Then Paul won't be all by himself.
Look, Jan, that's the last thing I could think of.
Yes, Florrie, I can well imagine that. But don't forget what you and your husband did for me during the war, when I was arrested by Rauder. I wouldn't have got away alive if your husband hadn't stepped in for me.
Thanks a lot for your call, Jan. I'll talk it over with Grimbert.
After this phone call, Florentine would sit down and have a long talk with Grimbert. She explained, as a widow, she could only give him so much, and her cousin was much closer to that of his father, and she proposed the idea of him going to stay there.
The choice is yours, my son. The unexpected offer seemed tempting to him. The village of Velp was never much to his liking. Now he had an opportunity to build a new life. Besides, he had already spoken several times with his uncle Jan, who seemed quite likable to him. He would gladly accept the offer.
Shortly after accepting, Grimbert was packed and ready to go. A feeling of sadness would come over her, but also pride. Her son was leaving, but he was going to get a new experience that she was unable to offer.
Inside of me I felt pride, because he now lived in the GUI region, where I had always felt so happy, where I had known almost every tree and every family, and where I had been married.
But later on, the relationship with her cousin would start to fall apart. He would make it difficult for her to see or talk to Grimbert while he was there.
He could no longer derive any advantage from my husband's connections, and I had nothing to offer. Sometimes, when I had something important to discuss with my son, I was not even allowed into the house but had to stand outside and talk through a small bathroom window. Thank God, there was a very nice couple, both of them former NSB members, who also lived there. Like me, they had lost everything, and now they had to earn their living as domestic help. They would keep me informed about my son.
About a year later, Jan's son would finish school and move out. After this, Florentine would receive a call saying that she needed to come get Grimbert and take him back home with her.
1 year was enough, they now had other interests. This came as a bolt out of the blue. During the year, my son had become accustomed to their lifestyle. For him, as well as for me, it was impossible to let him come back to Velp. What were we to do now?
When they got back home, Grimbert would tell her that he had a friend in the area and he wanted to stay with him, saying that he already confirmed with his friend's father and it was okay. So Florentine arranged a meeting to meet with the father. But she didn't know the shock she was in for when she would arrive.
In my old second-hand car, I drove to Barn, looking for the address. Finally, I stood in front of a high, black fence. The gate stood open, but it belonged to the crown land of Sostik Palace. I didn't know what to do. Then a gentleman appeared at the front door, beckoning me to drive in. He greeted me with the words, "Hello, Florrie, you are expected." Astonished, I replied, "You couldn't possibly be Jan van der Hoven, our old friend, who wrote such wonderful articles in our weekly paper De Waag. It simply can't be true." "Well, Florrie, times had changed. We don't talk about that anymore. Welcome to our house."
She was stunned.
How was such a thing possible? In the past, he had been editor of De Waag and very pro-German. Now he was the private secretary of Queen Juliana.
Grimbert would go there to stay. But she didn't know that her old friend wasn't as she knew him before. He was now a cult-like Christian.
Believers had to be confronted over and over again with their sins. Within a few months, these confessions had become such an obsession with my son that he lost all interest in life and neglected his studies. My brother-in-law Nico Rost van Tonningen, who was Grand Master to the Queen, alerted me to the danger. He was annoyed, moreover, by the fact that a young lad like this, the little boy of his brother Maynard, who in spite of their different political outlooks had been very dear to him.
After talking to Nico, Florentine would recognize this danger and immediately went to pick Grimbert up.
When I arrived, the door stood open. I reached the upper floor unobserved. There I found my son lying sick in bed, with Princess Margaret at his side. I told him to put on his clothes, pack his suitcase and come home with me. We took leave of the princess and traveled home.
Grimbert was in horrible condition, so bad that he had to learn how to eat again.
It was another trusted NSB man who called me with the message, "Let Grimbert come with me. I'll take care of him and see that he gets well again." My son had been thoroughly brainwashed and was undernourished. In retrospect, the whole thing seems like a well-contrived scheme born out of the guilt complex of the royal family over the death of my husband, in which Prince Bumhard had played such a key role. Out of a feeling of guilt, they wanted to come to a reconciliation. Queen Juliana, inasmuch as she let her heart speak, and not politics, must have been the prime mover in this. Or maybe it was politics after all. The reconciliation was to be accomplished through a union between Princess Margaret and my son Grimbert. After that, the problem could be considered resolved. But because of the way events turned out, this feeling of guilt has till this day not been erased.
The only positive that came from the situation was a strengthened bond between Florentine, her boys, and her brother-in-law Nico.
He often referred to the strong ties between the royal house and the Rost van Tonningen family. With his father having been Adjutant General of Queen Wilhelmina, and he himself Grand Master to the Crown, he felt that the development of such personal relationships would be out of place. This view of my brother-in-law also has general validity for the other reigning families of Europe. It was a matter of style and principle, which could never be disrupted, especially considering the still unresolved death of his brother Maynard.
After Mussert was arrested, he'd be charged with high treason. In a 2-day trial, he'd be convicted and sentenced to death. On May 7, 1946, Anton Mussert would be executed by firing squad. Florentine would set aside the rivalry between Mussert and Maynard. She gained a lot of respect for him.
Anton Mussert and Max Bloxagel behaved very courageously during their trials, an example for many. They died a hero's death.
She would appear in a documentary about Mussert in 1968.
Hij streed dus voor recht en gerechtigheid. Het Nederlandse volk wilde hij dus bewust maken van zijn krachten en van zijn prestaties. En deze wilde hij bundelen tot een nationale eenheid. En dat wilde hij eigenlijk uitdragen. Want het was natuurlijk in die tijd was het natuurlijk grote armoede en was een grote werkloosheid. Hij vond dat zijn beweging eigenlijk zorg starten moest, omdat er eigenlijk niets aan beantwoordde om die mistoestand te helpen. Hij heeft daarbij gekeken eigenlijk naar Italië, waar hij dus dat met zeer groot interesse bekeken heeft. En Italië was een fascistisch regime, maar voordien zeer chaotisch, zeer wanordelijk. En naarmate het fascistisch regime sterker werd, werd de chaos minder en het recht beter. En dat vond Mussert zeer positief. En deze bundelingsgedachte wilde hij dus eigenlijk ook hier in Nederland uitdragen.
Wat waren Mussert's ambities, dacht u?
En ongetwijfeld om het volk eigenlijk te winnen voor zijn eigen idee. Dat was zijn ambitie eigenlijk. Hij wilde dus een betere levensstandaard. Hij wilde dus de noodledigen en de mensen werk verschaffen. Mussert die was oorspronkelijk dus zeer verrukt van Mussolini. En in tweede instantie heeft hij dus Hitler gezien. Maar met zijn kennismaking met Hitler en de meerdere malen dat hij Hitler gezien heeft, erkende hij Hitler als zeer zeker zijn meerdere, waarvan hij kon leren en die voor hem verschillende richtlijnen uitzetten die hij te aanvaarden had. Hij verwachtte dus voor Nederland na een Duitse overwinning een zekere statenbond, een Europese statenbond, waar dus Nederland ook wel een rol in speelde en heer en meester was op eigen grondgebied. Maar de richtlijnen gingen natuurlijk van dat land uit wat het meeste offers gebracht had. En dat zag Mussert ook wel degelijk, hoewel hij wel hoopte dat Nederland ook een leidende rol zou spelen na de overwinning. Mijn man was president van de Nederlandse Bank en had dus daarin een vrij grote directe macht. En zeer zeker een tot verhouding van Mussert, die dus leider was van het Nederlandse volk, maar veel betrekkelijker macht is, waardoor men dikwijls als kleinere figuur bang was voor de grote superioriteit van mijn man. En daardoor dus moeilijkheden ontstonden.
After being released from Allied custody and the hardships she faced afterwards, she lived a relatively peaceful life. That was until 1983. In Nordic countries, they celebrate the summer and winter solstices every year. Florentine would do the same with her friends in her garden. But the celebration this year, a newspaper would write a whole story about the gathering. The paper would link her midsummer celebration to the Ku Klux Klan. Florentine maintained contact with various National Socialist groups all around the world, but any contact with the KKK she maintained was a lie. But it was in print, and the people ran with it.
They were able to stir up hatred against me. My house was pelted with stones and hit with slingshots. Over 100 window panes were shattered. Almost every night I was woken up by bomb threats. Even my dog was poisoned. Thank God, she miraculously survived, though not without lasting damage to her health.
Met 120 grote ramen. Ik leefde achter gaas. Mijn auto hebben ze rem van kapot gemaakt. Huis hebben ze in de fik gestoken.
Uiteindelijk op het eind hebben ze het...
Nee, steeds waar, continu.
Not long after, her contact with National Socialist groups would be posted.
Gesproken wordt, vraag ik mij wel af wat u bezielde om een internationaal gezelschap bij u thuis van neonazies uit te nodigen om van die vreselijke ideeën met elkaar te bediscussiëren. Waarom, nee, maar mijn vraag is, waarom deed en doet u dat?
Neonazies is geen woord, dat maakt u ervan.
Wat vindt u dan wat er bij u thuis zit?
Wij spreken over cultuur, over dat gewoon waar je wortel zit. Waar je wortel...
Maar wat voor mensen zijn dat?
Dat gewoon mensen als u en ik. Niks bijzonders.
We hebben beeld van zo'n bijeenkomst bij u thuis.
Ja, dat zal misschien zonder willen zijn.
Hitler was gassing the Jews. Hitler would gas 6 million Jews. The fact is, there's no evidence to believe that a single Jew was gassed. It is our duty to maintain the white race so that in 100 years from now, there will be white children being born, which it won't be if present trends continue. In 100 years from now, if present trends continue, London will be an Afro-Asian city, so will Paris, so will Amsterdam. We are totally opposed to that.
That's right. Yay! Brilliant. That's right.
Verstond ik het dan goed? Zei u heel mooi?
And many other things will be written about her, some stretching the truth, others completely made up, including accusations that armed local Nazis with firearms to shoot Turkish immigrants in the Netherlands. There's no evidence this ever happened, nor would she be charged with this or in connections to any shootings.
We would get a weapon supply here.
Yes.
We would get shooting exercises and everything.
Shooting exercises? Oh, she really had plans with you.
Yes. As a neo-Nazi group, actually.
Yes.
She is really a life-threatening woman.
And what was the purpose of those weapons?
We had to shoot Turkish crews.
Turkish crews?
Yes. Also to shoot people who were against her plans.
Florentine already didn't receive a full pension she was entitled to for Mainaud. But another newspaper would publish an article saying that she was using her pension to fund a Nazi organization. The Prime Minister would decide that she was entitled to the pension despite her beliefs or what she believed in. But the Parliament didn't seem to care, and they would bypass what he said, pushing through legislation directly aimed at Florentine. And both motions would be approved. This would begin a lengthy court battle.
Morgen debatteert de Tweede Kamer over het pensioen van mevrouw Rost van Tonningen, de weduwe van een van de meest vooraanstaande NSB'ers van ons land, die voor de oorlog voor zijn partij 3 jaar lang lid was van de Tweede Kamer. Uit dien hoofde ontvangt zijn weduwe nu 25.000 gulden per jaar. En daaraan, zo vindt volgens enquêtes 80% van onze bevolking, daaraan moet een einde komen, te meer daar mevrouw Rost van Tonningen haar denkbeelden blijft verkondigen.
But this was just the beginning. Florentine had purchased 2 grave plots for herself and her husband. When the mayor found out about this, he began proceedings to strip her of her rights to be buried there. He did this because English pilots that died in the war were also buried there. But the worst was yet to come.
My bank, in collaboration with my notary, forced me to give up ownership of my firm by threatening to withdraw all credit. My firm Verena, which had been in existence for 34 years and had a real worth of over 1 million Dutch guilders and a current account of over 200,000 guilders, was assigned to a former prizefighter from Suriname for 1 Dutch guilder. This man, a certain R.A. Kenswell, was put forward by the Rabobank, despite the fact that he had already gone bankrupt once before. No rights whatsoever were granted to me. As one witness later described it, when the notary brought up something in your favor, the Negro's nostrils would flare with rage. The notary feared that Mr. Kenswell would become violent and drag him across the desk. So, thinking about his wife and children, he declined to do anything in your interest. I had just been recovering from a serious surgical operation. Taken completely by surprise, I was unable to fully grasp what was happening. They made reassuring promises, saying that after a period of 4 years, all my assets would be returned to me. I wouldn't need to work anymore and would henceforth be able to enjoy the fruits of my life's work. The result of this devious act was that the bank installed Mr. Kenswell as head of the firm, with the obvious intent of bankrupting the company, thus making it possible to go after my personal assets. Immediately after taking over, Mr. Kenswell requested an audit by the Revenue Service. Suddenly all kinds of financial records had disappeared. My request that my records be returned to me was ignored. I was accused of having fraudulently taken money from the company. One lie followed another, and I was buried in an avalanche of additional assessments, against which no appeal was allowed. Personal bankruptcy was only avoided by timely help from friends abroad.
On February 26, 1987, 2 men would come to Florentine's home, telling her that her firm was going to be declared bankrupt. 34 years of her life. Blood, sweat, tears, gone.
It all became clear to me. I had to be destroyed, and in this they almost succeeded. Even my personal property was involved. It's easy to find a stick to beat a dog. Only the moral and material support of good friends enabled me to surmount this black hole.
Another year later, Florentine would meet with one of the men again, who would tell her that the entire thing was political, nothing more, and everything that she had worked for was gone, just for politics. One newspaper lying about her solstice celebration would cause her home to be repeatedly raided, vandalized, bomb threats, business destroyed, pension revoked, burial sites threatened, and constant harassment from the press.
An innocent midsummer celebration in my garden turned into a personal drama.
In July of 1990, Florentine would visit Germany.
Upon my arrival, I went directly to the Hotel Zumteken, where I would be staying for a couple of days. From the window of my luxurious room I could see the trees which, after 45 years of growth, now obscured the place where Hitler's beautiful Burghof once stood. Only those who remember can still find the foundations of the Burghof today. On Wednesday, April 25, 1945, the Obersalzberg was attacked by the 617th British Bomber Squadron. In 1952, this architectural masterpiece was blown up and completely demolished by the American occupation force. They felt called upon to do so, because they feared that it could become a place of pilgrimage. The next day I took a bus up the mountain to a parking space below the Kalstein house. From there a long tunnel leads toward the entrance of an elevator, which in 45 seconds takes you to the Eagle's Nest on the mountain's summit. This was the Führer's favorite place, his own paradise near our Valhalla. From here there is a magnificent view of the Watzmann and Hohegal peaks.
The bus was full of American soldiers. She would write about the difficulty of finding a seat somewhat away from them. Even if you did find a seat away from them, they were constantly walking around too.
Soon I was deeply absorbed in my thoughts. How different things were, compared with in Hitler's time. Now the whole area was taken over by the Americans. How well I could remember the moment when, together with my husband, I found myself in approximately the same spot, rejoicing at the wealth of simple beauty which Hitler had collected about him. His imposing writing desk, the precious chairs, the fireplace carved with eagles and swastikas, and not least, the very special chandeliers. Where had all of these things gone?
Moving away from the sad thoughts, she would step out and take in the beauty of the mountains and the view. And all the good memories started flooding back to her. Florentine would return to the Netherlands. Now she was a grandmother with 12 grandchildren, and she still hadn't known the full truth about what happened to her husband. She had spent essentially the rest of her life dedicated to compiling evidence on his murder. The evidence she found would prove that her husband was murdered, and the suicide ruling was used to cover for his murder. The only official responses she would receive was a death certificate that confirmed his death and a bill from a garbage truck they used to transport his body. As disturbing as this was, they would bill a widow for transporting her husband's remains on a garbage truck. This would be the least morbid of the whole story. She had heard rumors of abuse, and knowing what she and others had undergone, the likelihood that my now committed suicide was highly unlikely. But what she discovered was beyond what she could imagine, even more than the horrors she heard from others.
Nou, dat heb ik pas gekregen toen ik terug was in Nederland. Toen moest ik belasting betalen. Ik moest betalen 45 gulden voor de wegenwagen die oud vuil op had. Dat was een man ingooid. Hebben ze een mijn afgereden. Dat is het eerste begin dat mijn man... Je hoort verhalen. Je hoort verhalen, mijn man is het raam gesprongen en de trap gesprongen en dit en dat. En dan weer dat hij Brazilië was. Ze hebben ons in januari 25 aangeboden om Brazilië te gaan. Mijn man zei, ik ga niet, ik blijf hier. Ik zei, jij ga ik ook niet. Dus hij zei, ik ben de enige vrouw in Nederland gebleven. Hè. Alle vrouwen van ons moesten naar Duitsland.
After his capture, Mainau would be taken to the Elst prison camp, where he was relatively safe. He was the only multilingual person. He would work as an interpreter for General Koolroos during his negotiations with the Allies. He also wrote a proposal for the detained NSB members to be workers in Dutch New Guinea. He would also write a political testament in English that covered his whole life, work, and what he wanted to achieve. It was completed on May 24th, 1945. It would be written by him and stained with his blood to prevent any falsifications or forgeries of the writings. Mainau was offered an escape to South America, but he would refuse to leave the Netherlands. He was willing to endure the Elst camp conditions, but that would quickly change. Prince Bernhard would visit the camp, and he immediately recognized Mainau. He was furious, the two standing face to face.
Mijn man had Koolroos als de generaal van de landstoom, maar die Duitsers kennen nooit talen, ben je nooit talen. Mijn man zit Frans en Engels goed, dus mijn man was de enige van de 2000 gevangenen die zijn taal beheerst. Dus mijn man was natuurlijk een dolmetscher. En daar komt Bernhard aan. En die ziet, mijn man is helemaal dolmetscher van Koolroos. En wie is die schoft? Rost. Nou, en die is toen met, hoe heet die vent, van de Nationale, die andere keer, samen in Utrecht gebracht. En daar heeft man nog 2 dagen met elkaar in deze gezeten. En zogenaamd zijn testament geschreven. Ik kan deze wel niet, die begrepen er niets van. Wel correct. Maar Prebel heeft nagaan, heeft geld gegeven aan de onderwereld, uitleveren naar de schrijverij. En zo zijn onze mensen nemen. En is toen door Prebel uitgeleverd naar de schrijverij, dat die gruwelijk mishandeld is geworden. Wat nog niet tevoren in Duitsland nooit geschied is. Natuurlijk wordt er mishandeling gedaan. Maar dit wat zij gedaan hebben, dat zo'n man als Van der Leeuw ook zelf zegt, opstammen.
The prince quickly realized that Rost van Tonningen was a danger, because he knew too much. He had to be removed.
Mainau to be transferred to the Scheveningen prison, and his transfer only had one objective: his death in the most sadistic and brutal way possible.
He was given shoes that were much too small, forcing him to walk with tiny steps and causing him to trip. Having to wear these shoes was torture in itself, making it impossible for him to run with buckets of urine and excrement, as he was ordered. With him being the president of the Bank of the Netherlands, it was considered particularly gratifying to humiliate him as much as possible. He was continually beaten with truncheons. As a joke, they tied a string around his penis, yanking him across the floor if he wasn't quick enough to their liking. Sometimes they even pulled him up by the string. The main gangsters in this prison of torture and humiliation were Messrs. Pyle, Poot, Damhoff, Van Rijn, Pronk, and Dr. de Reyes. Nights were the worst. The guards would hire prostitutes and stage wild orgies, in which my husband was made the object of amusement. They would make a horrible din, one playing the piano, another sitting on top of it, stamping his foot to the music. The other drunks would then bellow out the beautiful song Oute. My naked husband would then have to salute and sing the national anthem. If he hesitated, they would pull the string. Every day they would draw large swastikas on the floor, which were then spit upon by the guards. My husband was then forced to lick the voordien. He was ordered to hold heavy bricks above his head until he fell to the ground, exhausted and often unconscious. Then buckets of ice-cold water were poured over him to make him come around again.
This would be the depths that Florentine would find out for years. But this was only the tip of the iceberg. Florentine would write a book, In Search of My Wedding Ring, Jeanette Houston would get word of this and ask Florentine to see it. It hadn't been in production, so Florentine gave her the only copy she had and asked her to make a copy and give her back the original. On September 22nd, 1990, Jeanette Houston would write an article in the newspaper about Florentine's book. On November 19th, Florentine would receive a call from Jan Wildschut. Mr. Wildschut was a resistance fighter during the German occupation of the Netherlands, but he returned in 1945 after internment. The atrocities he saw committed by the Allies, he had a change of heart. On October 3rd, Mr. Wildschut would go on Dutch television and say, "Rost van Tonningen was murdered. I have the evidence in my own sources." Mr. Wildschut on his phone call with Florentine would say,
"You must never forget that it is not possible for your husband to have shattered his skull in a fall from the first floor into the prison. In such a fall, someone breaks their neck. Shattering of the skull can only occur from a heavy blow with a rifle butt or something similar. Never forget this."
Only 5 hours after this phone call, Mr. Wildschut would be found dead in his home. Florentine collected testimony of many people who would attest to the fact that Maynard was murdered, including the head of the police in The Hague during the German occupation, who wrote a report saying,
"The prison warden had attempted to throw Maynard over the balustrade, but Maynard was able to hold on, when Maynard would be again struck with the rifle butt before falling."
Mr. Kreischer, cousin of Maynard, would be taken to a shed where Maynard's remains were being stored. Mr. Kreischer would write down the remains were so badly disfigured that he could only conclude that Maynard died a very violent death. One of the most disturbing abuses that Florentine found, she would say,
"This way the last little document could not be forged. And then, yes, then he had to die. This man, not only noble by birth, was forced to climb his naked, emaciated body into a barrel full of human excrement, to eat from it and lick his fingers. He was the prisoner of the underworld, of whores and pimps who deliberately he was being hunted. That was his death. This death had been planned for a long time, but the murderers of the president of the Dutch Bank would have preferred to enjoy his torment for a long time if his end had not come so unexpectedly."
The librarian of the prison had to sweep up the remains of Maynard's shattered head. He was so unnerved by this atrocity that shortly after he became seriously ill, it took him 2 years in a mental institution for him to recover.
Dim Kreischer, one of my husband's cousins, wanted to make a bicycle trip to Haarlem. But an inner voice told him to turn around and go to Scheveningen instead. He thought he heard Maynard's voice calling him. Even though he wasn't interested in politics at all, he was proud of his cousin Maynard and decided to bring him some flowers. He went to the prison and asked to see Maynard. Everyone thought that he was crazy. Who would ever be interested in what happened to the prisoners? Nevertheless, the door was opened for him, and he was taken to a shed. To his horror, he found the barely recognizable remains of my husband lying on a pile of garbage. The sight shocked him. Deeply shaken, he laid his flowers beside the body. The image never left him.
The director of the municipal hospital in The Hague would say,
"The mere remembrance of how Rost van Tonningen's mortal remains were carried into the hospital made me shudder with horror."
Despite everything she collected as proof that Maynard was murdered, she never received a reply from the state. They ignored everything, never returned his remains, or his confiscated wedding ring. Florentine would receive continuous harassment at her Velp home. Despite having supporters too, it became too unbearable. She would reluctantly leave her home in the Netherlands and move to Belgium. Florentine Rost van Tonningen would pass away on March 24th, 2007 in her home in Westminster, Belgium. She'd be laid to rest in Rieden, Netherlands. And during her burial, the township would lock down the entire area out of fear it would attract right-wing extremists.
In het Belgische Waasmünster is op 92-jarige leeftijd de weduwe Rost van Tonningen overleden, de vrouw van NSB-voorman Rost van Tonningen. De Zwarte Weduwe werd ze genoemd. Na de Tweede Wereldoorlog is ze verschillende keren veroordeeld voor het verspreiden van nazi-lectuur en voor het organiseren van nazi-bijeenkomsten.
Dus niet in publiciteit, ik heb het zelf niet omgevraagd. Men brengt mij in deze moeilijke situatie. En het is heel jammer. Ik heb geen grote mouwen zitten. En je natuurlijk belachelijk. Dat is wat men erin pompt. Ja, het is slecht. We zijn over Joden vermoord, dit en dat.
Bent u ook een van degenen die de Holocaust ontkennen?
Totaal. Totaal.
Is dat niet? U zult hier nooit anders over denken.
Ik weet hoe het geweest is. Dus
ook als u de kans zou hebben om nog, laten we zeggen, een speech te maken.
Excuus even.
Om de dingen die u zegt, of gezegd heeft. Omdat er misschien mensen zijn die daar verdrietig van worden omdat ze bijvoorbeeld veel familie verloren zijn. Zou u die kans dan aangrijpen?
Kom.
Maar als u die kans zou krijgen bij deze?
Dat komt helemaal niet ter sprake. Absoluut niet ter sprake.